The countdown.
Join us every Friday for encouragement, freedom, and biblical truth. Grab your coffee or grab your tea. It's going to be a good one. Well, hello, everyone. I have to remember, and Mike, just remember, we're on 3 platforms. So I have to open them all up to make sure everything is going well. So hello, Dale. I see you're on Rumble. As you know, I can't comment through StreamYard, so I had to just jump on Rumble real quick. So hello to everyone watching on Rumble. I do see we're live, I guess, and running on YouTube. Let me make sure, thumbs up, that my sound is okay. And then I want to check Facebook super quick. And, oh, I don't know. I'm clicking all these wrong buttons here because I don't know what I'm doing half the time. This is happening now. Okay, and I'm live on Facebook. So that is good to know. Okay. So anyway, Mike with a thumbs up. You okay if I say hello to a few folks? All right, I got a hearty thumbs up. Okay, so we've got Linda. Linda, I saw you come on before, so hello, sweet sister. I am so happy to see you. I hope you are doing well. I've got my beautiful best friend and moderator, Carly, is in the house. So hello, sister. Keep her in your prayer. She is not feeling well. She sounds like there's a frog in her throat. So, and her son is also under the weather still. So let's just keep Carly and her son in our prayers, which would be great. Kelly, hello, hello. Dale, I already said hello on Rumble, but I'll say it again. I've got my beautiful friend Yvette is here. And Lord, guys, just keep Yvette also in your prayers for direction and guidance. And she's an amazing friend of mine who lives in Canada. So Timothy, hello, brother. How are you? So good to see you. Trying to go pretty quick here. We've got Patty A. Hello. Canastan, California. How do you say that? I want to say Canistan, because Canada's in it. Canistan, thumbs up, Mike. I don't know. You're the smart one in the room. So I guess Canistan, thumbs, he's something. I don't know. Okay. When you come on, we'll figure it out. And Terry's in the house. Hello, hello. So good to see you as well. Reading the word, Miss G. So good to see you as well. Beautiful Oki is in the house. So good to see you. And look at that. Carly is just everywhere. She's on Rumble too. My sweet friend Bonita, it is so good to see you as well. We've got my other mod is in the house. Hannelore is here. And then Cheryl, hello, hello. We've got Corey and Dora. I can always take a few moments here because it's not like I have 900 people watching me. We've got Laura is here. Oh, Renee, you know how much you mean to me, Renee. And I'm going to always give you love every time I see your name. Okay, so I think I grabbed everyone there. So tonight is going to be a great episode. I have brother Mike back on, my friend Mike. But we're going to be talking about I call it the Olivet Discourse. I need to remove that. And it's really exciting. So I know that the last time he was here, we talked about one chapter of this book. I do have quite a few people who went out and purchased it. It's an amazing book, The Missing Key, and it dissects into, which, Mike, when you come on, if we can just briefly tell everyone, because imminence was such a small fraction of this book, and I would like just to give an overall view of what this book is about. So Excuse me as I cough. But anyway, I'm so excited to have him back here on the show. One thing I appreciate about Mike for sure is the fact that I can be myself off the camera and he can be himself and we can have dialogue and iron sharpens iron. I don't have many godly friends in my life where I know that both parties can agree to disagree agreeably. So I honestly, Mike, I appreciate you more than you'll ever know for that. I just seen Betty. Hello. So good to see you here. To those, Annie, hello. Love your little hearts. So anyone joining us on Facebook, I don't know who's there. So I just want to say hello to everyone there as well. So we are going to be diving into the Olivet Discourse. Mike is going to present some stuff here for us tonight. I have some of my notes here. Really, I want to say in the beginning, it's kind of like going to be an overview of what certain things mean. You may have heard the words before, such as, well, we all know what the rapture is, right? But the broad day of the Lord, what does that mean? He also mentions a few times in the book about dual imminence, birth pangs. What do these words mean? So we're going to kind of really, it's going to be a good Bible. I want to call it a lesson tonight, a good Bible study, but we're also going to be diving into Matthew 24. So if you have your Bibles open, please make sure you open to Matthew chapter 24. And it's going to be a good one. I promise you it's going to be a good one. And I'm really, really, really excited. So with that being said, what I would like to do, though, is introduce this week's mug. Okay, so I have used this mug before, and I just kind of felt led to use it again tonight because we have a lot of people within the body of Christ right now who are struggling, hurting, they're under the weather, they're in a financial strain. You know, we're living in some amazingly trying times. And I know in my own life, you know, financially, I have to do certain things now, da 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 da. I know a lot of us have been coming down with sickness. My thought is it's the air whenever they're spraying in it. But anyway, so I really thought that I can give everyone here an encouragement tonight with this mug. I have to turn it around here because it's only on one side. So it says the struggle is real. And we all know the struggle is real. You guys know I've used this before. But so is our God. The struggle is real, but so is our God, and he definitely is. So I see David Jack. Hello. Shalom, brother. So nice to see you here. And Kaylee, I've seen you guys just pop up. So I want to do that. And yes, Cheryl, I will be there next week. So I will be there. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to bring brother Mike on. And how are you?
Good. I'm glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you back. Absolutely. Even though the struggle is real.
The struggle has been very real this week. As always happens, whenever I come on Life Clips, I promptly get sick. And so I've got my big mug of Throaties tea here.
Okay.
And I apologize in advance for all of the probable throat clearing and potential sneezing or coughing.
No worries. We're family here. You know, you can even blow your nose on air, and I'm sure people will be totally okay with that.
I've got a tissue here just in case. I even have a lozenge. So
okay. Well, the tissue, you know, I might make you cry, so that's okay. Well, I'm glad you're back. The first time you were here, we ruffled feathers. I don't think we're going to ruffle feathers today. This is a beautiful overview of what we're going to discuss. I love it, and you know, I sent you screenshots of things that I wrote in the book. So in case nobody is aware, I mean, Dr. Andy Woods holds to the same view. J.B. Hickson holds to the same view. So there's many people who also hold to the same view that we're going to discuss here tonight. So it's not, I'm forewarning everyone, we're not out here in left field. Mm-hmm. I do have to interrupt that thought though, because this is a really good friend of mine, Ashley. So I just wanted to say hello. So glad you're tuning in on Facebook. Okay. So anyway,
So,
Um,
if I can just jump in real quick,
yeah,
I don't wanna, misrepresent anyone's beliefs, and I can say that Andy Woods and JB Hickson do not agree perfectly with what's gonna be presented today.
really? Even what I read and in
Absolutely.
my highlights? Oh, you just caught me off guard there.
Nope.
Really?
Nope.
So even in okay, hold on now, because even in this part that I totally took notes in, that whole section in there, Andy in his series 100% agrees with all of that. So you're saying outside of
Yeah,
that.
I'm not saying that they disagree 1,000% with
Yeah.
everything that I'm gonna present tonight. I'm gonna present a nuance that they do not espouse.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think I might know where you're going with that. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, I thought for sure Dr. Andy did. Okay. Well, then I misspoke. So thank you for calling me out. I appreciate that. So listen, let's discuss. And I think you did the first time you were on here, but then people just really got distracted. So discuss really what the missing key is all about. And then we'll lean into the things that we're going to talk about tonight.
Absolutely. So, The Missing Key is the book that I just published, at the end of 2023. And just trying to boil it down, make it as simple as possible and as quick as possible for this, because again, it's not going to be the main topic. The main topic of the book is not going to be the main topic of our discussion tonight. The understanding the Olivet Discourse is, of course, foundational in the book, and I spend a lot of time on it. But the missing key, what it actually is I present a paradigm for understanding the end times, and it's based on the teachings of Jesus. And so the paradigm I express in a series of three key claims, which are basically that the rapture and the broad period of the day of the Lord are number one, temporally connected, number two, simultaneous, and number three, both imminent. And if we had more time, we can break down exactly what I mean by all of those. But put simply, temporal connection basically means that they're connected in time or sequence. Now, no one's going to disagree with that. Everyone agrees already. If you have a rapture view, if you're a pre-trib believer, a post-trib believer, pre-wrath, whatever you are, that by definition is an admission that you believe that the rapture has a fixed temporal or sequential position in relation to the day of the Lord or events within the day of the Lord, like the tribulation or the wrath. And so that's not profound to any of us. We all already accept that. And yet it's a key logical underpinning for the rest of the paradigm. They occur simultaneously means that the rapture is the opening event of the broad period of the day of the Lord. And that's not something I feel we hear very much. Some people may believe it, but they may not speak about it very much. And I think it's very important. The rapture and the broad period of the day of the Lord, the rapture is a rescue of the righteous. And the paradigm that Jesus presents, or the pattern that he presents, is that when his parousia or his second coming, his coming initiates, in other words, the broad period of the day of the Lord, when it begins, it's going to begin with two simultaneous events. The first is the evacuation or the rescue of the righteous, and the other is the immediate beginning of judgment upon the wicked. Those two things are going to happen simultaneously. And then the last of the three key claims is that they're both imminent. And so the key here is to understand what imminence is. We spoke about it last time I was on, that it's signlessness, it's suddenness, it's unpredictability. It means that there's nothing that has to occur first. There are no signs that we're looking for that let us know that the rapture can now take place. The message that the New Testament has always given us, which is why we know anything about imminence today anyway, is that it's always been imminent. That's what Paul the Apostle taught. That's what Jesus taught. That's what the other New Testament writers taught, that it could happen at any moment. And yet, we're told the same thing about the day of the Lord. So both the rapture and the day of the Lord can initiate at any moment. We already said that they're going to happen simultaneously, but also that they can happen at any moment. And that, when you understand imminence, the fact that there is nothing that has to happen before it, then logically, that's another piece of evidence that they happen simultaneously, because you can't have two imminent events that one precedes the other if they're temporally connected. If they were not temporally connected, then logically you could. And I give an example of the book of that. But if they are temporally connected events, then they both can't be imminent if one precedes the other, because the occurrence of the first would furnish a forewarning of the second, rendering it no longer imminent. And yet they're both imminent. So it means that they must occur simultaneously. And this is taught clearly throughout the scriptures. Jesus relies on a couple of Old Testament examples that make this very clear. The example of Noah, the example of Lot, and then all throughout the New Testament, the subsequent authors comment on it, and they issue the same teachings. So there's this consistency of teaching all throughout the New Testament related to this. Now, the other quick part that I have to mention, because I'm going to get questions if I don't, is, well, what about the gap? What about the post-rapture gap? Do I believe in a post-rapture gap? Not only do I believe in it, I believe in it so strongly that it's actually a part of this paradigm. We didn't make it, we didn't label it as one of the key claims, and yet it's an equally important part of the paradigm. So the broad period of the day of the Lord begins with the rapture of the church, and then immediately following that, there's a post-rapture gap period of unknown duration. We don't know how long it could last. We know it's not going to last for more than a generation because of what Jesus said later in Matthew 24, which we can talk about later. But it has a maximum shelf life, maximum. That doesn't mean it has to last that long. The maximum shelf life of one generation, this post-rapture gap, and the 7-year tribulation that follows it. Because Jesus stated that the generation that sees the beginning of the birth pang signs is the same generation that's going to witness the final sign, which is Christ coming in power and glory at the end of the tribulation. So there can only be a maximum of one generation of time from the rapture to the end of the tribulation. So that, in a nutshell, is the paradigm that I present. And we're going to talk about it tonight in some ways, but mostly we're going to talk about understanding the Olivet Discourse, because the Olivet Discourse is the premier teaching of Jesus on eschatology. And so all of the subsequent New Testament authors, they all base their understanding of eschatology on this seminal teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. And clearly their writing reflects that. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. It's going to be a long one today, so I'm definitely going to rely on Kim to help me read some things. I'm getting over this cold,
And
and
I'm hydrated over here too. So
but I'm looking forward to it.
we're both going to be coughing and clearing our throats. So just so you know, and I think you already know that, I do believe there is a gap between the rapture and the day of the Lord, not the broad day, or however you call that.
Well, I would say the
I don't
tribulation.
Right, in the tribulation. So I believe there's a gap between the rapture and the tribulation. We have always, me and you, Mike, I don't agree with how long you think it is, but I do believe there is some
Well,
form of
I don't
gap.
have a
So
thought on how. I don't think it's a certain time. I'm just saying it's biblically, it has a maximum possible shelf life of
correct.
one generation. I'm not making a prediction as far
Oh,
as what I
and
think.
I don't think any of us should, and that's the whole thing. And I think that's that gray area of the Bible. I know in my flesh and in my brain, like I feel like things would have to not happen right away, but not too long. So, but I don't know. Again, we don't know. But I just wanted everyone to know that I thought we had discussed that though previously. Didn't you say you thought it was like
What?
maybe it was someone else that I talked to? Didn't you say you thought it was like 30 years or something like that? The
No,
gap?
I said the maximum shelf life could be up to one generation. So then the question becomes, what's a generation? People like to define it different ways. It could be
Yeah.
anything from 40 years to some people stretch it as far as 80 or maybe even more. I think
Yeah, I've
40
heard the
years.
120 camp because of
Yeah,
what happened with Noah. So
right. I think that's probably stretching it. I think
yeah.
biblically, a generation is probably 40 years. And so I think what I probably said to you in a private conversation was that it wouldn't surprise me one bit
Mm.
if the gap took decades.
And I think Bill Salas, I think he's in the camp, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments or if you know, but I think Bill think there's a pretty big gap as
I
well
think
because there's a
Bill
lot of
Bill
people, right?
definitely agrees that there could be a significant gap. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people in that camp who think that there has to be a gap and setting things up and doing whatever. And that's why I agree that there has to be some form of a gap. I don't think the rapture is going to happen and bing, bam, bada, boom, the tribulation starts because that's not biblical at
Right.
all. I mean,
There's
things
one
have
thing
to be
that
set up.
we won't get a chance to speak about it tonight, but I extensively detail it in the book. I have a whole chapter on it, essentially. There's one biblical precondition or sign that seems to have to take place in this post-rapture gap period. In other words, the Bible presents at least one specific event as being a day of the Lord event, yet it's post-rapture and pre-tribulational. And so that would necessitate the need for the understanding of a post-rapture gap that is part of the day of the Lord, but is
Hmm.
not yet in the tribulation.
And you're going to, I mean, because I don't know if everyone understands. It took me a minute to understand what you meant by the broad day of the Lord. So we're going to kind of dive into some of these terminologies tonight, right? So everyone kind of has a clear understanding of what we're looking at, correct?
Absolutely. That's what we're going to do right now.
All right. So you take the lead and go, and we'll go from there.
All right. So we're going to be discussing understanding the Olivet Discourse, as you all know, and it's going to break down into 5 different sections. The first 2 are foundational, like Kim mentioned. Number 1 is what is the day of the Lord? Number 2 is what and when are the birth pangs? Number 3 is introduction to the Olivet Discourse. Number 4 is the 2 contrasting halves of the discourse. If you don't understand that the Olivet Discourse has 2 totally contrasting halves, you're never going to understand the context. And then finally, number 5, who are the righteous in this discourse? There's a lot of debate on, is it possible that the church could be mentioned in this discourse or not? Is it possible that the rapture can be alluded to in this discourse or not? We're going to talk about all of that today, and I think you might be surprised. So let's begin right away with number 1, what is the day of the Lord? So the day of the Lord is, unfortunately, and it goes back to what Kim just said about some people maybe not understanding what I even mean by the broad day of the Lord. The unfortunate reality is that although many of us are well versed in Bible prophecy, or we listen to Bible prophecy teaching quite frequently, we're not well versed in the biblical definitions of certain terms that the Bible uses in its exposition of eschatology. And so it's so important. In fact, it's vital that we understand what the Bible means when it's communicating a certain term to us. And of course, the only way for us to do that is to see what the Bible actually says about it. In other words, how does the Bible use these terms? Because we can't come up with our own definitions. You know,
Right.
that happens so much. But we need to understand the totality of how the Bible uses certain terminology. And one of them, probably the best example of this, is the day of the Lord. It's often either not defined at all, or it's defined in a way that limits its scope in a way that's inconsistent with how it's actually used in scriptures. Now, this may be a bomb to some people. The tribulation is not the same thing as the day of the Lord. And it's very easy to prove that. The tribulation has a totally different beginning point than the day of the Lord, and a totally different ending point. And so, of course, they can't be the same thing. They're totally dissimilar terms. What we'll find is that the tribulation is a subset within the broader period called the day of the Lord. So, just most basically, what is the day of the Lord? What does it mean in Scripture? So, the day of the Lord, most basically, it refers to the times of God's direct intervention into the course of human history. And of course, God is the creator, and he therefore has a plan for his creation. He has a certain will and a certain way for it to go. And there's times where he actually has to intervene himself in order to accomplish these purposes. And I have a quote for you now, Kim, if you want to put that up on the screen. It's the first slide. This is by John Walvoord, and he brings out an important point that we're going to need to understand as we continue to deal with the day of the Lord. You know, some people have this idea that the day of the Lord is limited to a 24-hour day, and that turns out not to be the case. It's a period of time, and I like the way that he brings this out. Kim, are you able to actually read that for us?
Sure. I wasn't expecting that. Yep. So what I'm going to do, because no one can see me, is I have to move my camera though for a split second. So hold on 1 second. And if there's any questions throughout the duration, Mike has been kind enough to answer those. So while these are on the screen, I'm going to kind of scroll up and see if people have questions. But anyway, so just if you want questions.
What I'd like to do is, if we could, at the end of this first section, we'll just pause for some questions about the content that we've covered so far. And then at the end of the second section, we'll do the same.
Awesome. Sounds great. Okay, so we'll go ahead and read this quote here from John Walvoord. According to the Bible, the day of the Lord is a time when God deals in direct judgment of the world, in contrast to a time of grace when he does not. There were frequent days of the Lord in the Old Testament when God dealt with Israel because of their straying and would bring in an invader or would introduce drought or famine or some other catastrophe. These periods had a beginning and an ending, but obviously there were more than a 24-hour day. It was an extended period of time, long or short, depending on the circumstances. So let me fix that. Okay.
Great. So he brings out this understanding that there have been many days of the Lord already in the Old Testament, and we all know about them, right? The Babylonians were brought in to bring discipline and bring the southern kingdom of Judah into exile. Something very similar with the Assyrian Empire and the northern kingdom. Those are just two examples, but those were past days of the Lord where God directly intervened, oftentimes using a military invasion, you know, a foreign nation to come in and execute his judgment. And so what we're going to talk about today, of course, refers to the ultimate eschatological or end times day of the Lord. There's a final day of the Lord coming that all of those past historical days of the Lord, they foreshadow. They look forward to this final ultimate day of the Lord, where God's not going to use other armies. He's actually going to intervene. Jesus Christ is himself. And that's going to occur during, you know, this, it relates to the end times, this period called the day of the Lord. So there's a couple of nuances that we need to understand if we're going to have a biblical understanding of what the day of the Lord is. The first one is that the day of the Lord has a twofold nature. Now, what do I mean by a twofold nature? So it begins with a period of darkness that's associated with judgment, and it's then followed by a subsequent period of light that's associated with blessing. And so the judgment phase that it begins with is often described using terms like wrath and trouble and distress, gloominess, desolation, darkness, clouds, fierce anger, things like this, that just convey punishment, wrath, judgment. And so that's the beginning phase of the day of the Lord. When the day of the Lord begins, that's how it's going to begin. And yet there's a subsequent phase that takes place that's characterized by light and the outpouring of God's blessing under the reign of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, during the millennial kingdom. And so if you think about it, this follows the pattern of an actual Jewish day. So a Jewish day, most of us understand, begins at sundown. So by definition, a Jewish day begins during a period of darkness, and it's then followed by a period of light, obviously when sunrise takes place. And this is kind of an example of what the broad period of the day of the Lord is going to be like. And there's a number of examples. A lot of people don't recognize that there's going to be a period of light and blessing during the day of the Lord. They associate it only with judgment. And it's because I think most of the time the Old Testament, it always begins by emphasizing judgment. You can look in any of the passages, it always begins with the judgment. But then if you continue reading, you'll find that at a certain point in the passage, it notably shifts and it now turns very positive. And it generally speaks about the restoration of Israel in the millennial kingdom, the restoration of the earth during that time period, the blessing that's going to occur, and just how wonderful it's going to be. And so the language just shifts so notably. A couple of examples, we can't go into them in depth here, but if you'd like to write these down and look them up for yourselves, I go over a number of them in the book as well. But check this out in Joel chapter 2, Zechariah chapter 14, Zephaniah chapters 1 through 3, and there's many others, but those are just 3 examples that I can point you to, where in all of them, it's going to start out referring to the day of the Lord, and it's going to be very gloomy, very punishment related. But then at some point in the discourse, it turns joyful all of a sudden. And it continues, when it begins talking about it as being punishment and gloomy, it calls it explicitly the day of the Lord. But then as it shifts into the happy aspect, the joyful aspect, the blessing aspect, it continues to refer to it as in that day. So in other words, it's a continuation of the same subject. What day? The day of the Lord, the antecedent. And so I encourage you to check those out on your own. And moving on now, there's another nuance that we need to understand that closely relates to what we just described, and yet it kind of has its own nuance, and that is that the day of the Lord has a twofold, just like it has a twofold nature, it also has a double sense. And by a double sense, I mean that it's both broad and narrow in terms of its duration. The broad sense, of course, we already talked about it a little bit in the introduction. It begins with the period of time that begins with the rapture, and it's then followed by a post-rapture gap period. All of this is in the day of the Lord, and then it's followed by the 7-year tribulation, and then that's followed by 1,000-year millennial kingdom. So the broad period of the day of the Lord, or the day of the Lord in its broadest nuance, it begins with the rapture, it ends with the ending of the millennial kingdom. And go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
And so that's the broad sense. Well, what about the narrow sense? So there's also a narrow sense, and the narrow sense is a 24-hour day, most likely, or a very narrow period of time that refers to the specific climactic day when Jesus Christ returns at the end of the tribulation in power and great glory, when he comes bringing us, the saints, the church saints with him, and rescues Israel and establishes his millennial kingdom. That is the narrow sense. That is the climactic sense of the day of the Lord. And I'll just point this out for clarity, and I'm big on definitions, right? Because we can so easily be talking past each other. I like to refer to this event as the second coming proper. Now, many people call it the second coming, and that's fine. I do too, when I'm being casual. But when I'm being very precise, I call it the second coming proper. Now, why is that? Because everything that preceded it from the time of the rapture is all part of the second coming in its most broad sense. Just like when we refer to the first coming of the Messiah, we don't just mean, the day or the week of Jesus's crucifixion, do we? We mean the whole period that began with his birth in Bethlehem, his entire life up until the time where he went to the cross. And so that's all a period of his first coming. And so that's kind of the way that we need to learn to think regarding the second coming. It's all a period. The second coming begins with the rapture, and it ends with his coming in glory. So it's his coming for the saints, the church saints. Then it's his coming with the church saints. And so therefore, everything in between it is also part of his second coming. And we're going to talk about this later on in relation to the Greek word parousia, which is basically a synonym for what I just described. So we have the broad sense and the narrow sense. Now, Kim, if you want to advance the slide, this is my end times chart. I have 2 charts for you that are going to express what we just discussed, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in this chart, and I hope this helps, and this may be a good time to take screenshots if you'd like, although all of these charts are available in high definition on my website. Just go into the charts tab, LetUsReason.com.
Yep,
So
the website, just so everyone is aware, is in the description box below. Go ahead. Or sip on some.
Gotta pace myself.
There we go. I know.
So as you can see in this chart, we're currently in the present church age. We don't know how long it's going to last, but we do know what's going to end it, and that's the rapture. The rapture ends the present church age, and it begins the age to follow, which is the day of the Lord. And so that's then followed by a post-rapture gap period, as we've discussed already, of unknown duration, but it's during the day of the Lord. And so at some point, the Antichrist is going to confirm a covenant, and that's the marker for the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, or Daniel's 70th week of the Daniel 9:24 to 27 prophecy. Now, the 7 years, this final 70th week, so-called, is a period of 7 years, the 7-year tribulation. It's going to be split in half by a midpoint event called the Abomination of Desolation. So there's going to be 3.5 years on either side of that. And then that's going to end with the second coming of Christ, what I call the second coming proper, just for precision. He's going to then establish his 1,000-year millennial kingdom. And at the end of that 1,000 years, that's the ending of the broad period of the day of the Lord. So I hope that makes sense. And Kim, if you'd like to now advance it to the next slide, this is going to discuss some of the nuances, or it's going to express this broad period versus the narrow period, and then the darkness judgment phase versus the light blessing phase. So I hope these make sense.
They do.
And of course, just so lest anyone think this is just me saying this, everything that I've presented to you here has been well recognized, well identified by competent scholars for generations. So Kim, if you'd like to advance it to the next slide, I do have a quote here for you from Tony Garland, who's a very good dispensational scholar, like him very much. And if you're able to read that for us.
Sure. It's too much pressure on me tonight here, Mike, but that's all right.
At least it's not reading from the King James. Not yet, anyway.
Not yet. Listen, I have been theeing and thouing all day at work once I got the memo. Okay, the phrase day of the Lord is uniformly connected with darkness and judgment, whereas the phrases this day and that day do appear to be associated with the positive era subsequent to the initial dark elements of the day. The twofold nature of the day is characterized by, I knew I shouldn't have moved my camera, by a time of intense darkness followed by incredible blessings. And again, that was a quote from Tony
and
Garland.
that actually continues into the next
slide. The next slide. So I'm not done reading yet. This dual nature results from both a sequential division, judgment bringing in the kingdom of God on earth, followed by the blessings of the millennial reign of Christ, and a spiritual division. The enemies of God will experience only the judgment, whereas the people of God will experience the blessings of the millennial reign.
Perfect. Now, if you advance it one more, I have one more for you to read.
Okay, I'm just forewarning you. I'm not smart like you. So if there's any big words in these, I'm going to be butchering them. So you're going to have to jump in and help me. I'm just letting you know, okay? I might be a paralegal, but there's a reason I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
Okay, continuing to quote here, or actually a new quote from Ronald Showers. We should note that the biblical expression, the day of the Lord, has a double sense, broad and narrow, in relationship to the future. The broad sense refers to an extended period of time involving divine interventions related to at least the 70th week of Daniel and the 1,000-year millennium. The narrow sense refers to one specific day, the day on which Christ will return to earth from heaven with his angels.
Perfect.
What do I need to do now, Captain?
So they both just said what we've already just spent some time saying. right? So I
Mhm.
just wanted to assure you that that's not some new doctrine that Mike Filipek just contrived. So continuing on now, in conclusion, we can see that the biblical term, the day of the Lord, is not equivalent to our term, the tribulation, which of course is the 70, like we said, is the 70th week of the Daniel 9:24-27 prophecy.
Mhm.
It's rather, the tribulation is a subset that falls within the broader period of the day of the Lord, although the tribulation concludes with the narrow period of the day of the Lord. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you guys can see the distinctions there that the Bible makes. We didn't have time to go through and demonstrate this from the scripture point by point. I do it in the book. But if we did that today, then we'd be talking about the day of the Lord for the entire time, and we'd never get to the Olivet Discourse. So,
Correct.
so I put those quotes from the scholars up there just to show this is not something that I just made up. But we can pause right now if you'd like, if there's any questions just related to what we've talked about so far.
Okay, so yes, so there's two questions related to what we've talked about so far, but you already answered this. So I don't know if PRC just didn't. He might have come in late, so that's the only reason I'm. Can you just? I don't know if that's a question. That's how I took that. The day of the Lord, is that equal to the 7-year tribulation? And you kind of explained it, but I wasn't sure if they got the response. So can you just really
Yeah.
quick
So, like
again?
we said, the answer is no, because for a reason as simple as this, if we can show from scripture, and I named off, at least 3 different chapters where you can go and see this for yourself. If we can conclude, if we can see that the millennium is included in the day of the Lord, then how can we say the tribulation equals the day of the Lord? That's simple enough, right?
Agreed. Okay, so this one, it's not on the broad day of the Lord. However, we did talk about it in the beginning. So it's the
Sure.
only reason I'm bringing it up. So this is for my friend Michael. Why are people so fixated on a post-rapture gap period?
No, I appreciate that question. And without, I can spend a lot of time on this or a little, and I'm going to try to just do a little. Like I said, I have a whole chapter on it in the book where, and I said this earlier. Um, well, let me rewind a little bit and just put it most simply. People in our modern generation, scholars, Bible teachers, prophecy teachers, seem to have, um, and of course, we're talking about people in the pre-tribulational dispensational persuasion of which I am, Kim is, all the scholars that we're going to list tonight are, and the most Bible teachers, I think, have embraced this idea of a post-rapture gap period because it seems to be a necessity. And because the Bible does not say that the rapture initiates the tribulation. In fact, as I alluded to before, and as I said, I have a whole chapter on, there seems to be at least one biblical reason that necessitates the conclusion of a post rapture gap. I make it much more specific that it must be included in the day of the Lord, yet what
Mm,
happens is it's clearly post church age, yet pre tribulational. And I can't get too into it here. You can search it out for yourself. But most people, just most broadly, they seem to understand that if what I just said is true, that the Bible does not say that the tribulation begins with the rapture, then that right there at least leaves the door open for a post rapture gap period. Yeah, if I got any more into it, I'd use a lot of time. So maybe we'll move
maybe you'll
on.
have to come back on. I know I told Mike that
Well,
tonight
let me.
was probably going to be the last guest night, but maybe you'll just come on and we'll talk gap for like an hour and then we'll be done.
Well, I'd love to talk gap, but let me just say before, if you don't want to buy the book, which I hope nobody thinks I'm here to just sell books tonight. I'm here to teach the Bible, and if you don't want to buy the book, you don't have to. Go on my website. There's a free article that I just published on the seeming necessity of a post rapture gap. It's a
Mm.
good read and it's free. And leave me a comment. Tell me what you think.
Okay. Well, there we go. All right. So moving on. So that's it. The other comment is not really topic related. And I believe David stepped away anyway, but I am going to keep that one starred for the other Q&A. And I'm going to really try to edit this so we can do little segments on my channel. Okay. So we kind of covered all of that. Hopefully, I mean, I feel like I pretty much understand all of that because like you said in the beginning, Mike, terminology, I mean, I kind of always thought I knew what the day of the Lord meant, but there's so many things that are used interchangeably sometimes in the Bible that it can get a little overwhelming and confusing. So I appreciate
Right.
that. And I really like now, I totally get now the broad day of the Lord. So that helped me personally. Your book has helped me. And again, you know, I haven't read through the entire thing, but a majority of it I have. So what I've kind of honed in on has really helped me. The dual imminence thing, I was really confused about all of that. So anyway, moving on.
Yeah, so the precision is so important. And when we discuss precision, of course, it only matters if we're defining it as the Bible does. The Bible is very competent at self-defining its own terminology. And so that's what I try to do in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And when we just simply allow the Bible to speak, then all of a sudden, all the things that appear contradictory to us, we start to understand we only think that it's contradictory because of our own incorrect suppositions or
Mm-hmm.
presuppositions. But when we allow the Bible to speak, it is actually quite easy.
Mm.
So moving on now, the second thing that we need to discuss by way of foundational preparatory definitions and concepts is the birth pangs. The Bible speaks about this concept of the birth pangs.
Mm-hmm.
So what and when are the birth pangs?
When a woman goes into labor. I'm teasing.
There you go. It's definitely based on that.
I have no clue because I've never had a child.
Well, I have not either, but from what I've heard, my good friend, his wife just endured a 36-hour labor, if you can believe that,
Okay, no, I
and
think I would
she
die.
wanted to do everything natural, and that was the course that it took,
Mm.
and um, I can only imagine what she went through during
Mm.
that time period. But for those of you ladies who are on tonight who are mothers, you can relate to this segment. Absolutely. So the
So
birth
let me just interrupt you before we get started. So again, for those who are just tuning in, after each segment, we're going to do a very quick Q&A after each segment. Make sure only for that segment it's topic related. If I'm assuming you'll take another question if at the end, whatever.
we will.
But for these segments, just so we can get a grasp of what's happening, because we need this grasp first, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but we need to understand these fundamentals first before we can shift into the Olivet discourse. Because without an understanding of what we're discussing now, going into Matthew 24, there's still going to be confusion to the
That's
dialogue.
exactly right. And let me put it to you this way. Matthew 24 was written to people who were literate in the Old Testament, people who understood Old Testament concepts and terminology, especially as it related to Judaism, which is what the Old Testament is linked with or based on. And so um, the problem that we have today is that we don't always have a very strong command of the Old Testament, or at least not a very precise command. So we want to make sure that we understand these foundational terms, that then when we get to the Olivet Discourse, we're not going to be confused, and it's gonna form a scaffolding for us to understand the Olivet Discourse.
Okay.
So, what and when are the birth pangs? So, the birth pangs of the Messiah is a major theme of the Bible and ancient Judaism, of course, and it refers to the time of struggle for the nation of Israel that occurs close to the time of the Messiah's coming, or as we understand now, comings plural. The mother, of course, represents Israel, and she endures these birth pangs or these labor pangs, this travail, like she's in labor in order to bring forth the Messiah. And there's many Old Testament mentions of this, and many in the New Testament as well. A couple, if you'd like to write it down, you could look it up later. Jeremiah 30:5-8, Isaiah 13:6-9, and Isaiah 26:16-21. Now, where this becomes very relevant to us is the fact that many Bible teachers incorrectly teach that we are experiencing or seeing the birth pangs now. So they take this concept of the birth pangs, that as we will find out, is a day of the Lord occurrence. They are day of the Lord judgments. And they try to import those into the church age. This is a problem. And if you do this, you're going to not understand the Olivet Discourse, because the Olivet Discourse, Jesus mentions birth pangs. So if you don't know already where the birth pangs fall before you begin Matthew 24, you're going to be confused at the context already. I hope that makes sense. So the birth pangs are not related to the church age. And it grieves me because I hear so frequently, even good prophecy teachers who would agree with me that the birth pangs are not occurring now or cannot occur during the church age. They will often just kind of haphazardly make like an offhand reference or a partial quote of a birth pangs passage, excuse me, a birth pangs passage, and attribute it to today and act kind of off the cuff as if we're experiencing that now. And that's not the case. So I want you all, when you're listening to people teach about these things, I want you to listen to the comments that they make. They'll make comments like that. They'll just throw it out there. And I guess either hope that you don't know your Bible, or maybe they don't know their Bible and they're just kind of throwing it out by habit because it's become so popular to attribute these things to now. But we're not seeing them now, and the church is not going to see them. It's going to happen on the other side of the rapture.
I have a question for you, though, Mike. I just noticed a comment. I just happened to look up. So some of the verses that you gave, they're saying that you're saying them too fast. So is there any possible way, Vanessa, I don't know if you'll be around at the end of this. I am going to be making chapters and then separate videos for our dialogue this week. But is there any possible way that you can just go back right to the beginning of the birth pangs at least? And
Yeah,
then
I can repeat those.
Okay, and let me type them in as well. So go ahead.
So Jeremiah 35-8, and that of course refers to a context.
So chapters 35
Jeremiah
through 38.
chapter 30, verses 5-8.
Oh,
Yeah.
so Jeremiah 35 verses 5 to 8.
30. Jeremiah chapter 30 verses 5-8.
5 to 8. Okay. So Jeremiah 35 through 8.
Yeah, and then Isaiah 13 verses 6-9.
Okay.
Isaiah 26, 16-21. And of course,
Isaiah
all
26,
of these
16,
and many more are in the book.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to move on now to discuss, well, when do the birth pangs begin and end? Now, as I just alluded to, the beginning is a much more controversial subject. So what we'll do is we'll just start, and of course, I already told you the answer, but we'll start just by discussing when they end. And this is not controversial at all. The birth pangs end at the second coming proper, what I call the second coming proper of Jesus Christ, at the end of the tribulation. When he comes in glory to the earth. All right. This is the end of the period of birth pangs. What's more controversial is when they begin, as I just spent some time discussing. The birth pangs, we will find they begin at the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord. They are those initial judgments of wrath that come forth as the day initiates. And the most straightforward passage, there's many that I could take you to. I mean, it's not just like a proof texting thing. You could literally, if you understand what the day of the Lord is in the Bible, it always, and we went over this already, it always begins with the period of wrath, the period of judgment, the gloomy period. But the most, I think, straightforward passage that just brings this out with such clarity is 1 Thessalonians 5:2-3. So Kim, if you want to put that up, I will actually read through this one.
Oh, of course, because it's ESV. I got you. I see how you're working it, Mike. Yep, I got you.
Well,
all right, y'all see how
pause.
he's doing this, right? He's gonna have me read the Kingeth Jameth version, and then he's all like, "I'll read the easy one."
I'm saving the good for you. All right.
It's okay.
All right. So this reads as follows: 1 Thessalonians 5:2-3. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come It's speaking about the coming of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord has not begun yet. It's the coming. The day of the Lord will come or initiate like a thief in the night. And let's pause right there for a second. A thief in the night, it's imminence language. It's a thief is signless. It's imminent. It can happen at any moment. There's no warnings. There's no precursors. There's no predictability. It's unpredictable. It's sudden, signless, just like the day of the Lord. All right. Continuing. While the people are saying there is peace and security. Okay. He's referring to the context, the period of time before the day of the Lord begins. What is that? That's the church age. At the end of the church age, at some point, the day of the Lord is going to immediately, suddenly begin, but it's not going to happen out of a time period where everything's falling apart. It's when people are expecting peace and security. Now, this is the opposite of what you often hear from many prophecy teachers who seem to expect that the day of the Lord and the rapture are going to happen out of a time where things are just so horrible and everything's going wrong and we're seeing signs and the world is falling apart. That's never what the Bible teaches. It's always the opposite, and we'll continue to see this as we continue, but I want to point that out to you. It's telling you the context of the coming of the day of the Lord. It comes during a time of relative normalcy. Then sudden destruction. The day of the Lord comes as sudden destruction, will come upon them as labor pains. Now, this is the Greek word Odin, and it refers to birth pangs, what we're talking about. As labor pangs come upon a pregnant woman, they haven't started yet. Keep that in mind. The context here is not the climax of the birth pangs. It's not the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. It's the absolute beginning of the period, the sequence of the birth pangs, which initiates with the broad period of the day of the Lord. So if you're not understanding that there's a broad and a narrow day of the Lord, immediately you're not going to understand this verse, because you're going to say, how can the birth pangs begin at the climax of the birth pangs? If you just think there's a narrow day, this verse makes zero sense. You have to understand the broad and the narrow day. It's not saying the narrow day begins with birth pangs. The narrow day is by necessity the end, the climax of the birth pangs. The day of the Lord as a broad period, it begins with the beginning of birth pangs. Just like a woman in labor, right? There's an initial pain or pang that you feel at one point where you had never felt a birth pang prior to that. But after you feel that first pang, it initiates a sequence, a series where the birth pangs are going to increase in three key areas. They're going to increase in frequency, intensity, and duration until finally it results in you giving birth to the baby. And so you can see the analogy here to the coming of the Lord. They're going to continue to increase as time goes by until finally the Lord comes at the end of the tribulation. So I hope that makes sense. And there's so much, this is just such a rich passage for us to understand context. All right. So it's clear to us that the birth pangs do not and cannot begin until the broad day of the Lord begins. That's in fact what distinguishes the coming of the broad day of the Lord. It comes suddenly, like with sudden destruction, like birth pangs. Okay. So again, just so you don't think I'm making any of this up, I have a quote that, Kim, it's actually going to be 2 pages. So when you get to the end of the first slide, you're going to have to continue on to the next. So if you'd like to read that, I would be grateful.
And again, remember, any big words, I'm going to butcher them. So Paul asserted that the destruction at the start of the broad day of the Lord will come just as suddenly as travail, the birth pang. What does LIT stand for again?
Literally.
That's what I thought. I was going to say literally because that's
literally the birth pang, singular.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because in legalese, that's what they do too, but I didn't know. Okay, so literally the birth pang comes upon a woman who was about to give birth. 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Paul used the singular form of birth pang and placed the definite article the before it. This, together with his emphasis on how the day of the Lord will start and the suddenness with its destruction will come, indicates that Paul was referring to the very first birth pang. It is a woman's very first birth pang, not the later hard labor birth pangs. That comes suddenly at the start of the painful process of giving birth. Thus, Paul was teaching that the beginning of the broad day of the Lord will be categorized by the first birth pang.
All
Oh,
right.
hi, everyone gets to see my apartment. I love pens, by the way. I have a collection of pens as well. Okay.
And so it's so clear from this passage, and I love clear passages like this, that the scriptural teaching is that the birth pangs begin as the broad period of the day of the Lord commences. So there should be no confusion at all as to the context of that passage.
And I know we'll get to it too, but simplicity is also just look at the story of Noah. And that's why I think it's used in Matthew 24. I mean, to me, that's always been my rub, I guess, with prophecy teachers, because I never agreed with that, because it's life is normal and then boom.
Right.
Like, I don't know. Okay, well, we'll get there.
We're gonna get there, I promise.
But that's what I'm saying. Isn't that the same? That's the birth pang.
It is, absolutely. And so that's, in fact, that, as I said at the outset, that's the pattern that Jesus uses to teach us about eschatology, about his parousia, his coming, about the beginning of the broad day of the Lord. That is the pattern. And then he uses the pattern of Lot as well in exactly the same way. And so, as you know, I spend a ton of time on that in the book. I mean, that's the basis of the missing key paradigm. And so all of our key claims are rooted in that pattern that Jesus teaches us. In fact, he tells us the whole point is there's no other way for you to understand the parousia of Christ if you're not understanding it according to that pattern. And so let's now move on. So we understand that the birth pangs are not happening now, and they're not going to happen at any point during the church age. So if you want to advance the slide, what I've done is I've taken one of the previous charts and I've just kind of overlaid this directional arrow of the birth pangs just to give you a visual. So again, they begin immediately after the rapture and they culminate at the second coming proper of Christ. Excuse me.
Do you need to pause? I can sing a song. You need to take a drink.
I try to do it while you're reading.
This is the day. Okay, I got you. Go ahead.
All right. So what we're going to do now is just going to quickly skip ahead for a moment to look into the Olivet Discourse. Now we're going to come back. We're going to learn about the Olivet Discourse from the beginning. But while we're talking about the birth pangs right now, what we need to do is just take a moment to jump right in to the Olivet Discourse, because Jesus uses this same Greek word, Odin, the birth pangs, that we just saw in 1 Thessalonians that Paul used. And in fact, as you know, the understanding is that Paul got his teaching from this seminal teaching of Jesus in the Olivet Discourse. We're just approaching it kind of from the backwards. So Jesus, and again, we're going to come back to discuss this, but one of the questions that Jesus was asked by his disciples that initiated this whole discussion of the Olivet Discourse was related to the signs of his second advent. In other words, the disciples were asking about the signs of the broad day of the Lord, or the signs of Christ's parousia. And we need to take another quick detour here to define parousia. What is parousia? Parousia is the word in Greek that's often translated in English as coming. So when you, in our English Bibles, so in Matthew 24, you know, what are the signs of your coming? What are the signs literally of your parousia? And
can you spell that? I want to type it in. I think I have it right, but just confirm.
Parousia.
It's Paru.
Yes.
So Parusia. Yes.
Parousia.
Ousia. Just so people know what you were saying there. Okay, there you go.
And so the parousia, we said it's the Greek word used to refer to Christ's coming. But I want to point out to you, this is very important. It's not a technical term in the New Testament. Now, what is a technical term? A technical term is a biblical phrase or term that's used the same way every time. Parousia is not a technical term. Why do I say that? Because some of the time it's used to refer to Christ coming for the church at the rapture, and other times it's used to refer to his second, what I call his second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. And so the understanding then is that this entire period is his parousia. I hope that makes sense.
Does for me.
So parousia, we have to learn to think of it as it's not just a momentary or a singular event. The parousia is the entire judgment phase of the broad day of the Lord that begins with the rapture and ends with his coming at the end of the tribulation. So it's one long period of his coming with different phases, if you want to think of it that way, where it encompasses a series of events. And again, lest you think I'm making this up, Kim, the next slide is a quote from Dr. John Hart, if you would grace us with that.
You're killing me tonight, Smalls. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, I
Okay.
need a break to take a drink.
All right. Okay, so the noun designating the coming in Matthew 24:37 is parousia, a term that easily covers a wider span. The Greek word parousia is capable of a more broad conception than just arrival. Generally, our English term, the first coming of Christ, refers to the 30 plus years of Christ's life, not just his conception or birth. So the thought of coming resident in the Greek word parousia carries the nuance of a span of time. Is it just this one slide?
It continues.
Okay. The parousia of Christ involves his arrival in rapture, his subsequent hidden presence in the world while protecting Israel and carrying out the judgment of Revelations. I just put an S at the end of that. You guys can just go ahead and ding me now. Judgments of Revelation 4-18 and his final manifestation after the Great Tribulation. And there, next slide.
That's fine. That's
Okay.
it. Perfect. So I just want, it's just what we just said. I just wanted you to know that, again, I'm not just making it up. So getting back to our subject, now that we understand this concept of parousia. So Jesus was asked by his disciples about the signs of his second advent or the broad day of the Lord or his parousia. We're using them all as kind of somewhat synonyms referring to the beginning of that period. And then Jesus responds, of course, by detailing a complex sequence of signs, beginning with events that he refers to as the birth pang signs. So keep in mind, the context here is the broad day of the Lord or the parousia. And let's take a look at this. Unfortunately, this is KJV for Kim, but this is Matthew 24:4-8, if you want to put that up. I'm going to actually, you know what? Actually, if you can read this.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, Matthew 24:4-8. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye not be troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Odin, Strong's Concordance number G5,
Perfect.
Next slide, or stay right there.
You can stay right there just for a moment.
Okay.
So all of these are the beginning of Odin, birth pangs, that same Greek word that we just saw in 1 Thessalonians that Paul used. So again, Jesus and Paul are saying the same thing here. They're expressing the same thing, the same time, the same context. They're talking about the judgment events that take place immediately as the broad day not ends, but begins, not comes to a climax at the end of the judgment phase, begins. Okay? So that's the context. And just like Paul, Jesus here in Matthew 24 places the birth pangs during this parousia period of the day of the Lord, the broad day of the Lord. All right. Like he kind of puts it as the beginning of the end. All right. So you can take that down now. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay.
Now, there's a third confirmation of this. All right. So we have two confirmations so far. We have Paul and Jesus saying the exact same thing about the context of the birth pangs, but there's a third confirmation. And that's the fact that the birth pangs described by Jesus here in Matthew 24 are equivalent to the first four sealed judgments of Revelation 6, 1-8.
Agreed.
So all of the, and we need to keep this in mind because there's been a lot of what I think is falsehood being spread by people who subscribe to the pre-wrath view of the rapture, where what they're trying to tell you is that not all of the sealed judgments are part of the wrath of God. This is not true, and we don't have time to fully go into it tonight. But the fact of the matter is that all of the sealed judgments are part of the wrath of God, and they're occurring during the broad day of the Lord. And Jesus is personally in heaven, and the church seems to be pictured there with him. And again, we can't go too deep into that tonight. But again, that also would indicate that it takes place after, not during the church age. The church is not on earth anymore when these are getting unveiled. And Jesus is personally in heaven unveiling these. These are the wrath of the Lamb. There's no other way to cut it. He is casting these judgments onto the earth as the broad day of the Lord begins. And if you want to bring up the next slide, this is a chart that I think should make it very easy. I call it the beginning of birth pangs equals the first four sealed judgments.
Okay, so
And
I guess what I said, so in the beginning, an hour and 15 minutes ago, this is where Dr. Andy Woods does agree.
yeah, there's a lot that I'm saying that I think Andy would agree with.
Okay,
I
so
don't
maybe
think
that's where I
there's
got confused then in the
right.
beginning, because I know he does see it this way.
Yes. So on one column here we have the beginning of birth pangs, and that's of course in Matthew 24, 5-7. And then the other column has the first four sealed judgments, Revelation 6, 1-8. So what we find is that when we look at these, they're identical. So if you go to Matthew 24, you start reading about the birth pangs, you see that it mentions false messiahs who will mislead many. Well, that's the first seal. The rider on the white horse, a false messiah figure, comes forth conquering. Then if we go back to Matthew 24, the beginning of birth pangs, we see mention of wars, rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. Well, that's the second seal. The rider on the red horse removes peace from the earth and brings warfare and death. Going back to Matthew 24 again, the beginning of birth pangs, we see famine. Well, that's the third seal. The rider on the black horse holds a pair of balances representing famine. And then lastly, one more time, going back to the beginning of birth pangs, we see a mention of death through famine, pestilences, and earthquakes. Well, that's the fourth seal. The rider on the pale horse brings death through famine, pestilences, wild beasts, etc. And so we can see that they're identical. And so these are three different reasons, Paul, Jesus, and then what we know from Revelation, that all confirm to us the context. The birth pangs only begin in the day of the Lord, not in the church age. So I have one final quote here that I would, final meaning for this section, that if you want to put that up and read that, this is one more from Renald Showers. And he's basically just going to state exactly what I just told you.
Okay, hold on one second, because someone had a question, and I want to make sure that what was just discussed would answer Timothy's question.
Yeah, and we can take those questions right after you read this, because we'll be finished.
All right, next slide. So you want me to read this one, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Since the beginning of birth pangs of Matthew 24 and the first four seals of Revelation 6 are the same thing, and since the broad day of the Lord will include the beginning of birth pangs, as Paul states in 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-3, we can conclude that the broad day of the Lord will also include the first four seals of Revelation 6. Only slide or go to the next one.
That's it. Just okay. He was just saying what we just spoke about. Again, just so I'm not making it up. So if we want to take any questions right now about anything we've discussed up to this point.
Timothy said actually what you just said, that, ask Mike, my bad. So here's a question here. So question, I got to read this for podcast. Since the birth pains start at the rapture, what are we experiencing now with the present earthquakes, rumors of wars, and other stuff described in the discourse?
We're experiencing the church age, and we're experiencing what's been happening since time immemorial.
Okay. I just thought this one was fascinating. And then he said what you're saying was garbage.
So Paul is writing to the church. Yes. I don't see that that's a problem with what I just said.
Okay. Oh, hold on. I don't know if this is topic related. Okay. Yes, it is. Whoops. Wrong one. Hold on. I got stuff jumping around here. So just Vicky, hello. To understand, it is being stated that the beginning of birth pains is equal to the first seals. You
That's
do not
correct.
believe that we are in the birth pangs currently.
No, not only do I believe that we're not in the birth pangs currently, what I've just described precludes the even possibility that we could be in the birth pangs. So the biblical teaching, as I've just shown through these three examples, these three different confirmations, is that the birth pangs, by definition, begin in the day of the Lord. They are the beginning judgments of the series of the judgment of the day of the Lord.
Agreed. I mean, I agree. And then, because I've said this time and time again, I always used to use at the end of this podcast when I first started 4 years ago, Luke 21:28. Look up, for your redemption draws near. And JB and Andy both called me out on that. So that's why now they were like, if you want to use one, do Titus 2:13, because that's more.
Right, because
what
that
we
was
need
written
to.
to
Correct.
Israel.
So that's what I mean. So they even know that the birth pangs are not. We're not looking up for anything.
Right. And I think basically any sound Bible teacher is going to express that. If you're hearing people telling you that we're experiencing the birth pangs now, I would say it's probably not a sound Bible teacher. You're probably listening to somebody who's making a living of capitalizing on so-called rapture signs and hype and not exegeting the Bible.
I mean, I agree. I've already lost enough, so I don't mind if I lose more. I already agree. That's no other questions.
Yeah,
I don't
and
think
of
on
course,
that.
I can also add that, what I'm doing is I'm taking you through the scriptures, and I'm giving you evidence and reason, and then I'm backing it up by just putting a couple of quotes at the end of everything that I'm saying from the top of the top, the best of the best scholarship-wise. And so I don't think you're gonna find any. You may be hearing this kind of stuff on YouTube, but if you read scholarly writing, if you read, sound books, commentaries, I don't think any scholar is ever going to say we're experiencing the birth pangs. That seems to be more of a YouTube phenomenon.
Agreed. All right. I don't think there's any other questions on that. So what is our next?
All right. So we're now going to begin to discuss the Olivet Discourse. So,
Okay.
so as the earthly ministry of Jesus began to progress toward its culmination, he began to increasingly disclose new revelations or prophetic truths that related to his future eschatological return, things that he never talked about previous to that in his ministry that referred to his parousia. And the reason for that is because there was no need for a parousia, and so therefore no need to talk about it before the Jewish nation formally rejected him. So there came a point in his ministry where they outright rejected him. And of course, at that point, the necessity of a second advent came into view. And Jesus would begin to incrementally disclose these new truths over time. And of course, Jesus, as a master teacher, he understood that you can't just dump an entire new paradigm on somebody and expect them to fully understand it and grasp all the different nuances of it right at the get-go. So what he would do is he would gradually, incrementally plant these seed doctrines over time. And so what we refer to as the Olivet Discourse was kind of the seminal work of Jesus as far as prophecy, related doctrine, anything related to his second coming. This is where he This is the culmination of his teaching. And so the discourse, we refer to it as the Olivet Discourse because it took place on the Mount of Olives. And Kim kind of jokingly put all of it because I think it was Andy who quipped that somebody thought it was called the All of It Discourse because we get all of it. Jesus tells us all of it in there.
Well,
And
just so you know, why I did all of it is because I knew that biblically you would dive into all of it and what it all meant.
well, there you go. That's good too.
Okay.
That's good too. I accept that.
Okay.
So this discourse is recorded in three Gospels, Matthew 24, and it continues even into Matthew 25. And that's the most detailed recording of the three. Then it's also recorded in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. Well, we're going to focus mainly on Matthew 24, which is the most detailed version, although we will at times refer to the others. So the context of what was happening here is that Jesus and his disciples were walking past the temple buildings, and the disciples began to remark about its grandeur, the size of the stones that were included in its construction. And Jesus totally surprised them by his response. He said that all of these stones, there's coming a time when they would all be thrown down and the temple would be destroyed, is the implication. And we can read that if you want to put up Matthew 24, 1-2.
Am I reading that too?
If you could.
Sure. Okay. And Jesus went out. And again, this is from Matthew 24, 1 and 2. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. It's the next slide too, correct?
No, you can.
Oh, okay.
That's it. We're going to go verse by verse through a couple of these, not through all of them.
Okay.
So what we see here is basically what I just introduced. So we're going to then move on to verse 3, which tells us that Jesus's disciples, 4 of them actually, as we're told in Mark 13, it's Peter, James, John, and Andrew. They later came to him privately, inquiring about his statement. They came to him while he was on the Mount of Olives. And so again, that's why it's called the Olivet Discourse. And they ask Jesus what seems in English at first glance to be 3 questions, but we're going to find out that it actually seems to be 2 questions. And both of them, this is very important, both of them concern the same overall subject, the broad day of the Lord. In the disciples' minds and their understanding, they thought that what Jesus was referring to was a day of the Lord destruction. They associated it with the end of the age, with the messianic advent. And so in their mind, when they were responding to Jesus, they were thinking end times. Although, as we'll talk about, Jesus actually was not focusing on the end times. He was focusing on a nearer term aspect of fulfillment that would take place only about 40 years later in 70 AD. So go ahead and put up the next one, Matthew 24, 3. Yeah.
And I'm assuming you want me to read it.
Yeah, you could. Yeah.
And as he sat upon the mountain of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world?
Great. You can leave that up there for a moment. So we see a couple of questions here that the disciples asked him. They asked, when shall these things be? That's one question. That's the when question. And then there's a what question. What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So although that may seem to be like 2 questions, what's the sign of thy coming end of the world? It's actually one question. He's just kind of adding a different nuance to it. But or this is common in Greek or in Hebrew even, where they say the same thing twice or just phrase it a different way. But the context is the same. The sign of thy coming end of the end of the world, because his coming happens at the end of the world in their understanding. And it does. And so, again, just to show that I'm not making this up, we can move the next quote on to the screen. And if you want to read that.
The sign of your coming. Oh, this is by Craig. Was that Blomberg? Was
Yeah,
Bloom?
something like that.
Okay.
Close enough.
The sign of your coming and the end of the age in Greek reads more literally. The sign of your coming and the end of the age.
And I just have to jump in for a second.
Uh-huh.
I'll read this one actually.
Okay.
So the sign of your coming and end of the age in Greek reads more literally, the sign of your coming and end of the age. By not repeating the definite article the before end of the age, Matthew's rendering of Jesus's words is most likely linking the coming of Christ and the end of the age together as one event. So that's just what we just said. I just wanted you to see it from a scholar. So, in the disciples' Jewish understanding of eschatology, the expected coming of the Messiah, of course, which in this case we recognize as referring to his second advent, not his first advent, obviously he was there, was an event that concluded the current age. It brought the current age to an end and introduced a new messianic or kingdom age. We would recognize that as the millennial kingdom. And so the disciples, they had the correct eschatology, but as we'll find out, their understanding of what Jesus was specifically referring to was not exactly correct, because they didn't understand there was a nearer term context in which this destruction would take place. So but what we need to understand is what Jesus responded to then, and we'll talk more about this. When he responds to their questions, remember, they frame their questions in the context of the day of the Lord. Their questions all related to a context of what they thought he was talking about was related to the end times. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about it, but this time period was the broad day of the Lord. That was discussed, of course, in depth throughout the prophetic Old Testament scriptures, and this would have molded the disciples' understanding. This is what they knew was coming at the end of the age. But further yet, there's little doubt that even the topic of their first question would have associated the topic or would have associated the same context, right? The timing of the destruction of the temple with this same period and context. So to them, we need to recognize when we read it is that all aspects of their questions, both questions, related to the broad period of the day of the Lord, what we spent so much time talking about already, right? So I have two successive quotes that if you want to put up and read, the first one is Stanley Toussaint. The second one is Thomas Ice. And they're just going to say what I've just told you.
In their mind, they had developed a chronology. How do you say that word? Chronology. Hello, it just took me a minute to get there. Developed a chronology of events in the following sequence: the departure of the king. Number 2, after a period of time, the destruction of Jerusalem. And number 3, immediately after Jerusalem's devastation, the presence of the Messiah. They had good scriptural ground for this, since Zechariah 14:1-2 describes the raising of, is that raising or raising?
Raising, yeah, R-A-Z. It means destruction.
Okay, thank you. The raising of Jerusalem. The same passage goes on to describe the coming of the Lord to destroy the nations which warred against Jerusalem, Zechariah 14:3-8. Following this, the millennial kingdom is established, Zechariah 14:9-11. And then
Right.
finally,
I'll just make a quick comment on this before you read the second one.
Mhm.
So basically, Dr. Toussaint here is just saying what I just described, that this was the chronology. This was the understanding of the disciples. The king was going to depart because Jesus had told them, that's what Jesus had told them, that he had to leave. But then after a period of time, Jerusalem would be destroyed. And then immediately after Jerusalem's destruction, the Messiah's return. All right. And this is what it seems to say in Zechariah. And if you want to go on now to the second quote, Tommy Ice is going to give us a little further insight.
Okay. The disciples were right to think of Zechariah 12-14 and Zechariah's teaching about Messiah's coming. However, they were wrong to relate the impending judgment of Jerusalem and the temple with the return of Messiah.
Okay, so the disciples, for good reason, assume that the coming destruction that Jesus referred to was an end times destruction, that it was associated with the end times day of the Lord, a far term context. But they didn't realize that, as I alluded to before, that there's actually a nearer term destruction that would occur only about 40 years later, in 70 AD, when the Romans came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And here's a key point. We will find that Jesus addresses both contexts, the near-term context, 70 AD, and the far-term context, the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to take place in the day of the Lord. So he addresses the first century context and the day of the Lord context in this discourse, if you bring all three recordings together. All right. So that's the conclusion of our third section. We're now going to move on to the fourth section, unless there's any questions up to this point.
No, but I do have these two things for encouragement for you here. So this is from Pippa. She's glued to her screen. Love it. Fascinating.
I appreciate it.
So, and then hello, Vin Dog. I just seen you jumped in. So hope you're doing well, brother. So I don't see, I mean, I haven't really looked. I don't think I'm missing anything. Hence the reason I keep looking, because the last question was just Vicky. So I think we're good. I don't know of anyone, but yet there's a delay. So I guess we can kind of wait just a smidge. If anyone,
again, we're going to continue to talk about the day of the Lord throughout the remainder of this this podcast. So if anyone thinks of any questions, or they don't come through for a couple more minutes, you're not going to lose your chance. We're still going to do questions at the end, and it's all going to relate to the day of the Lord. So, or I'm sorry, the Olivet Discourse, if I said the day of the Lord. All right, so moving on now, let's go to our fourth section, which is the two contrasting halves of the discourse. So picking up kind of right along with our walk through Matthew 24, what we just talked about, the disciples asked these questions. And so if you're Jesus, understanding this dual context, how are you going to answer these questions? Especially when, especially this when question, right? We said there's a when question and a what question. How are you going to answer this when question? You know, since you're Jesus, that there's going to be a near-term fulfillment that the disciples don't know about. The disciples knew about the far-term fulfillment because it's talked about in the Old Testament, right? But Jesus knew that there was a near-term and a far-term fulfillment. So, but yet the way the disciples framed their question related completely to the day of the Lord context. So Jesus had to answer both. And that's exactly what we do find. And so here's the point of confusion, though. Jesus never mentions the near term, or the 70 AD, the first century destruction, in Matthew 24's recording, or in Mark's. He absolutely never even mentions it. It's only found in Luke 21. And yet, interestingly, Matthew and Mark still record the when will these things be question. So the common approach to this is to suppose that Jesus didn't at all answer this when question at all in Matthew 24. And this is maybe a problem, I think, because it would seem strange and maybe even a little bit deceptive if Matthew recorded the question and then didn't record any answer in the discourse. That would seem to be confusing. Why would he have even recorded the question if he doesn't give any answer to it? And that's the typical view. So that would be the view of the majority, I would say, of dispensationalists. They believe that the when question doesn't get answered in any form in Matthew 24, and only is dealt with in Luke 21, when Jesus does deal with the near-term context. So he answers that when question of 70 AD, when the destruction would take place. And I'll tell you what he uses to demarcate that very shortly. But I want to start to present to you an alternate view, because I don't think that view is I don't think the view is correct that Jesus does not at all answer the when question. Remember, Matthew still records the when question, and I think Jesus answered it. In fact, I know he did. So an alternate view, and this is the minority, and yet very good dispensational scholars do advocate this. So it's not without scholarship, Okay, it's just not the majority view, but it's the view that I'm absolutely convinced of, and I think it's the only view that adequately understands the Olivet Discourse. So this alternate view I'm going to present to you is that Jesus does in fact answer this when question, but he answers it in the latter half of the discourse, the verses that begin at verse 36 of Matthew 24, and then Matthew 24 ends with verse 51, and then it continues even into the beginning of chapter 25. So that's what I'm calling the latter half of the discourse. It's all about the when, and we'll see that as we continue. In Matthew's recording, instead of referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, right, as the when, Jesus's answer focuses on the timing of the day of the Lord. And again, this makes sense because the disciples' assumption was that the temple's destruction was related to the end of the world. The entire way that they framed their question was related to the end of the world, right? So in other words, the Bible answers the question according to the theme and the context of each chapter. In Luke 21, like we said, that chapter is unique in that it's the only one that addresses the near-term context. The other two, Mark 13 and Matthew 24, they address the far-term context, right? Although even in Luke 21, we'll find that it addresses the far-term context as well. And so Matthew and Mark, though, they exclusively are focused on the eschatological context, whereas Luke actually gives you both. So Jesus's answer may have been recorded, deliberately recorded differently by the Holy Spirit in his inspiration of the intended context of these chapters, right? So each chapter has an intended context. It has a specific purpose to teach us about something. And so, of course, it would make sense to understand that those purposes were actually achieved, right? The Holy Spirit's purpose in Matthew 24 clearly is not to teach us about AD 70, because it doesn't mention it. Whereas the purpose in Luke 21 discusses both AD 70, and then it also refers to the when of the day of the Lord. Whereas Matthew 24 and Mark 13 only refer, the only when answer given in those is related to the day of the Lord, right? There's no near-term context. So that's a little complex. You may have not heard that before, but I hope it makes sense.
Well, you also because when I read your book, I've always agreed with this, by the way, and not just because you're sitting here. This has always been my take as far as Matthew 24. I just knew there was something the way it started, but it didn't end that way. And I was like, well, why didn't he just start with the latter part instead of starting with the beginning part? But anyway.
Right. No,
so with that
said, and we're going to discuss that. That's a literary device called a chiasm. And we're going to talk about that, where you reverse it.
Well, what makes sense, and this is how I wrote this, just for those listening. So the first, it's divided in halves, really. So your first half is your verses 4 through 35, and then the second half is 36 through 44. So if somebody wants to write that in the chat, that's basically what we're separating here.
I would actually say through not just verse 44, but through the end of the chapter itself, and then even into the next up
for
until
25.
Verse 13.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I didn't write that on there, but yes.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying, because a lot of people who are reading it, kind of like the book of Revelation, they're taking it like that bird's eye view chapters. First of all, like chapter 11 is a bird's eye view. It's like a pause in the action. You know what I'm saying? And I know there's a technical term for that, but that's the same principle with reading Matthew, not to that degree, but where it can seem very confusing when you're reading Matthew, because our brains are set on thinking one thing because we've heard all of this on YouTube channels, unfortunately, about birth pangs and look up for
right. So we innately think that everything is sequential, everything is linear. And so, in other words, when you're in verse 35, you think that sequentially in the narrative, it's just going to continue to verse 36, right? But what happens at verse 36, and we're going to talk more about this, is it reverts the context. That the context totally changes. And so we can't just be lazy and say, well, verse 36 follows verse 35, so it comes after it in a sequence. No, the context actually changes, and we're
Mhm.
alerted to that by a handful of indicators in the text.
Mhm.
But just to kind of put a synopsis of what we've said so far. So in Matthew's recording, Jesus does not at all address the 70 AD context, right? The near term, but
Mhm.
instead answers the when question in verses 36 through 51. And how does he do that? By communicating the broad day's unpredictability. Everything beginning with verse 36 until 25:13 is all about the unpredictability of the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, not what Jesus just finished discussing, not the end, not the climax, not the second coming proper at the end of the judgment phase. It doesn't continue right into it. It reverts now back to the beginning, exactly what the same context that we read in First Thessalonians when we took some time to read the writings of Paul, where he was discussing the absolute beginning,
Mhm.
right? He used the idiom of a thief. Well, where do you think he got that from? He got that here. Jesus does the same thing. I think it's in verse 36 or 37. He begins by talking about the unpredictability of the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord, the suddenness, the way that it arises like the coming of a thief. Now, nothing about the end of the tribulation is anything like the coming of a thief. It's not sudden, it's not unpredictable. It's not signless, right? There's tons of signs. It's totally predictable. There's nothing sudden about it. You can't. I think I said this to you in the past, Kim, when we were talking about imminence. Imminence is suddenness, right? So if you're walking down the street and I pop out from behind the tree and I scare you, I can't scare you after I've already scared you. See, it was imminent until I scared you. And then after that,
Mhm.
you've already been scared. It's so that's kind of like the whole thinking that the context here can't be anything in the day of the Lord. So only the beginning, the absolute beginning of the day of the Lord, the broad period, can take the world uh, suddenly by surprise. Once it
Mhm.
begins, there's nothing surprising. In fact, all throughout Revelation, we're told that the wicked people actually understand exactly what's happening, and
Absolutely.
they attribute it to the Lord, that
Mhm.
they're experiencing the wrath of the Lamb in the broad day of the Lord. I mean, there's angels circumnavigating the earth in every language preaching to people. Like, there's
Mhm.
no confusion at all
Correct.
about what's happening. People
Right.
aren't trying to attribute all of that to common, like nature and stuff. Like, oh, yeah, there's what is it, 20-pound hails falling. It's just like a
Mhm.
bad weather year. No,
Right.
they know exactly what's happening. They're simply unrepentant and they're apostate.
Mhm.
And so there's nothing sudden, there's nothing signless about anything after the broad period begins, right?
Right.
So this is all context. And the context is so easy when you train yourself to be sensitive to the use of imminence language. Okay. And
Mm.
imminence language we talked about in the last time I was on with you. So if anyone did not see that, I would just refer you back to that. Um, so let's go to, I don't have actually a passage for you to put up. I'm just going to read this to you. But let's come with me, at least in your mind, to Luke 21. And so I told you that Luke,
Can you give me a second? I can put it up on the
eh,
screen.
yeah, you could do that.
Yeah?
So it'll
That way
be,
they can follow along. It just
yeah, so
kinda
it'll be Luke 21:20, or you can look it up in your own Bibles. And while Kim's finding that, I'll give you the context. So I told you before that Luke, in this recording, Jesus is going to address the near-term context, the 70 AD context. So when the disciples ask the when question, this is Jesus's answer to the when question in the near-term context. Okay?
and
So,
you said Luke 21:20, right?
correct.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. So, well, I'm ready to just read it. So I'll wait for you to put it up.
Yep. Alright, let's do this. That way folks can see it. Okay.
Can I read it?
Yep, sure can. And that's where it's starting, guys. Okay, go ahead.
Yep. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know. Wait, what did he begin with? He said when. He's answering the when question. When you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. All right. So this refers to the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. This is the near term. And I can't fully exegete Luke 21 right now, but there's reasons that show us that. That the context is not the day of the Lord right now. The context is before all those things. Okay. However, if you looked ahead to verses 34 to 36 in Luke 21, you'll see that it also addresses the timing or the when question of the broad day of the Lord, which very closely resembles what Jesus said in Matthew 24, 36 to 51, and also in Mark 13, 32 to 37. So these are all parallel. So Jesus, at some point in all of these, he begins to shift from signs to signlessness. He shifts from non-imminence to imminence. He shifts from complete predictability and signs to the complete lack of signs, the complete unpredictability. So that's how you understand the context shift. And it's so obvious in all three of these. They all follow the same format. So according to this understanding, Jesus's answer in Matthew 24, as well as in Mark and Luke, it was structured as a chiasm. I mentioned this term earlier. What is a chiasm? A chiasm is a literary device that's often seen in the Bible and often used in the Gospel of Matthew, in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then it's repeated in reverse order. So what are we talking about here in terms of a chiasm? Jesus or the disciples ask Jesus the questions. They ask him the when question and then the what question. But then Jesus doesn't answer it in that order. He flips the order. He answers first the what question, the signs. The whole first half of the discourse is all about signs in the day of the Lord, signs that occurred during the day of the Lord. These are not church age signs that we're not going to see, but Israel will see. People who miss the rapture, they will see these things if they survive till the end. The whole first half of the discourse is all about signs. And then the latter half is all about the opposite, signlessness, but it addresses the when aspect, right? So this is a chiasm. And Kim, if you want to put up the next quote, this goes for 2 slides, and if you'd like to read that. And again, he's just going to say exactly what I told you.
Is it John Hart? I am on the correct one. Okay.
Yeah.
It is true that in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Jesus does not take up the AD 70 event. However, this does not necessitate that the first question of the disciples remains unanswered in the discourse. Contrarily, it is likely that Jesus answered both questions of Matthew 24:3, but in reverse order. From a literary point of view, Matthew structures these as a chiasm. It is well known that Matthew brings order and precision to his gospel. What the heck is that word?
Chiastic.
Thank you. Structures in Matthew are quite common and are fully appropriate in light of his precision. The chiasm is as follows. A1 question, when will these things happen? Verse 3a. B1 question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? That's verse 3b. B2 answer, what will be the sign of my coming and of the end of the age? Verses 4 through 35. A2 answer, when will these things happen? Is verses 36 through 44.
Good. So he has 36 to 44. I would say to the end, to 51, the end of the chapter, and then even into clearly it follows even into chapter 25 up until about verse 13. But we're saying the same thing. We get the point. So it's just illustrating this is the chiasm. This is the chiastic structure that Matthew uses and that Jesus uses, you could say, to answer their questions. All right. So let's review. We're going through Matthew 24, right? We're not going to be able to pause and stop and talk about every specific nuance or aspect of Matthew 24, but what we're trying to convey mainly today relates to the overall context, and you're not going to understand the overall context if you don't understand the two contrasting halves of the discourse. That's going to help guide your perception of the context better than anything else in the world. Okay, so let's quickly review. As we're going through Matthew 24, we see that Jesus began with the birth pang signs, right? In the day of the Lord. He proceeds then to discuss all of the great tribulation signs. Excuse me. He then concludes with the culminating sign, which is the sign of his coming in the sky, in the clouds, in great glory, and his coming to the earth at the end of the tribulation. And then he refers to the regathering of Israel. Now, then he proceeds to the fig tree parable. And we're not going to talk too deeply about this. I already mentioned it earlier. We talked about it more in depth the last time I was on, and I talk about it in the book. But he then proceeds to the fig tree parable. Again, something that's been misunderstood by a lot of people, but he uses it to summarize everything that he just said and to inform his audience that the same generation that witnesses the beginning of the birth pang signs is the same generation that's going to be there to witness the climactic sign, his second coming proper. All right. And this is where the context changes after this, beginning in verse 36. All right. Everything after this, we said it already, it changes from signs to signlessness. Starting in verse 36, the context notably shifts from a discussion of observable signs that precede his second coming proper. Okay. I want to say that again. I want you to follow me. Follow the context. It shifts from a discussion of observable signs preceding his second coming proper. Okay. That's day of the Lord context, to a discussion of the non-existence of observable signs that precede the onset of this broad period as a whole. So I hope that makes sense. So Jesus first begins by giving a sequence of all the signs in the day of the Lord that lead up to his final coming at the end of the day of the Lord, or at the end of the Parousia, right? His second coming at the end of the tribulation. But then in verse 36, he reverts to answer their when question.
Correct.
Well, the when of the day of the Lord, the when of the Parousia, in other words, the when of his coming. That was literally what they asked. When? When? And it in their mind, it related to his coming, his Parousia. And so Jesus gives you the answer to the when. The when is, it's unpredictable. And so everything from verse 36 on, it only refers to unpredictability. Whereas everything before this, it was all about signs. Okay.
Correct. And let me just interrupt you real quick so people understand. And it's just common reading. And again, it literally 36 starts with the word but
Right.
of that day. So clearly, if you just read that, so that would be any reading. If anyone's reading a novel and it's giving a description of Joe Schmo and Sally Q, and then all of a sudden it says, but blah, 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 you know that the but was talking what happened before the story he just told. I mean, I'm not the smartest person.
You're absolutely right. And you're so correct that that's actually the meaning in the Greek. So the Greek, when it says,
Wait, hold on. I might not know big words, but say this one. No, I'm teasing.
yes, you are so correct. And I go over this in the book, is when it refers to but, right? It's now concerning. This is the Greek phrase peridei, and it's very important to annotate a difference in context, not necessarily a shift to an completely different context, but a shift to a different nuance or a different aspect of the foregoing context. So it's still the day of the Lord. The context is still the day of the Lord, but this peridei is often used to interject a change or a shift in context to a different aspect. So he's shifting from the signs of the day of the Lord to now the unpredictability of the timing of the day of the Lord. So in other words, he's shifting from answering the disciples' second question to now answering their first question. He's going from the what to the when. All right. Now, if you want to put up the next slide, this is a chart that I think will make sense to everyone here. And it focuses on, first is Matthew 24, 4-35. The focus is all on signs. We see that in verse 34, after, the culmination of all the signs that Jesus describes in answer to the disciples' questions about the signs. He says, when ye shall see all these things, know it is near. Right? The verse that people so often want to put into the church age. But
Mhm.
that's referring to the day of the Lord. The people who see all those signs in the day of the Lord, then they can know that the final sign, the climactic sign, the coming of the Lord in glory at the end of the tribulation is near. But then look at how the latter half of the discourse, Matthew 24:36 to 25:13, the entire focus is on the absence of signs. All right, verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. Wait, he just got done telling us you can know that it's near, but now he's saying no one can know. It's a
Mhm.
shift in context, right? And then in verse 42, ye know not what hour. And then in verse 44, in such an hour ye think not. And then in verse 50, an hour he is not aware of. Verse 13 of the next chapter, ye know neither the day nor the hour.
Mhm.
And so there's a notable shift here in context. And if you don't recognize it, you're not going to understand Matthew 24. So let's go right now to Matthew 24:36 to 39. And this is the next slide.
Did you want me to read that?
If you could.
Okay. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be.
Okay, so let's talk about it. So this is the exact same context that Paul was discussing. Let's go through this. So we see, but of that day, but of peri day, now concerning, it means
Mhm.
that's the shift, and it's even evident in the Greek. But of that day and hour, so he's talking about what? Day and hour, timing. What's the disciples' question? When? That was their first question. Now he's addressing the when. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So it's completely unknown. It's completely unpredictable. It's completely signless. There's nothing that can give us any information as to when this can occur. It's simply imminent, as we find. And it continues, but as the days of Noah were. So now he's going to employ the example of Noah, the flood of Noah, as a teaching tool, as an example for us to understand the day of the Lord, what he just spoke about. But
Mhm.
as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now he's going to point out two specific aspects here from the flood of Noah, right? We can't just use our imaginations. What was Jesus talking about here? A lot of people think he's talking about the Nephilim. That's not even remotely what Jesus is talking about here. And if you want to know how I know that, I'm going to read verse 38. And this tells us exactly explicitly, it's from the text. It's exactly why Jesus invoked the days of Noah, not to tell us about the Nephilim, right? And that's not to say that that activity wasn't happening back then. And it's not to say that that activity won't take place in the end times. I think it will, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here. Verse 38, he tells us exactly why he uses this example of Noah. It's explicit. He says, for as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. So there was a time of total relative normalcy, right? When
Mhm.
most people talk to us about the days of Noah, they want to convey to us that it was a horrible time. And I'm not saying it wasn't, but they want us to understand that when Jesus uses this example, that Jesus is conveying, oh, it was such a horrible time. Everything was falling apart. That's not what he's conveying here. It's very clear. He's conveying the relative normalcy of that
Mhm.
time. He's saying that
Amen.
in that time, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, right? What did Paul say? We talked about it before. It was a time of peace and security, right?
Mhm.
It was a time like any other. It was not a time that's notably different. It's normal for whatever time period not that there's ever a time of complete peace and normalcy, but it's relative normalcy, right? There's nothing
Correct.
different about this time period.
Right. And a lot of people also, just to solidify what you're saying, where it's always been a rub with a lot of people, and they've asked the question, and I'm so glad you're talking about this, because they're saying that during the tribulation, who's going to have time to be, now there will be partying it up in a degree. I get that, right? There's going to be some form of lawlessness and perversion and stuff going on. But as far as a normalcy, everyone's just marrying and drinking and having a good time. A lot of people, including myself, I could never wrap my head around that. Like, during the tribulation, you're trying to survive. Who's going to have time to be like, by thee I wed? I mean, like, it just doesn't make sense. So a lot of people, when they had that question, Mike, they were literally answering their own question of what Matthew 24:36 was truly all about, right? So
Right. And so the context is, it prohibits us from even considering that Jesus would use such language to describe the period of time that's where there's business unlike anything the world has ever seen.
And I just put
Jesus
this
is
comment.
describing the opposite. He's
Correct.
describing total normalcy. And sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, Okie girl, because she said that too. Why would you marry if you had no future? Like, that is a valid point right there.
Right. I mean, what the book of Revelation describes is people are hiding in the rocks. They're in the caves of the earth.
Right.
They're in torment. And what Jesus is describing are people, are living in this relative ease. And so there's no crossover at all in context. So it's clear then that Jesus is referring to the context of before the day of the Lord, which is obvious. And so he continues, until the day that Noah entered into the ark and knew not until the flood came, right? The people knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And so there's two things Jesus focuses on there. The first one we just spent some time talking about, the relative normalcy and the way that the flood judgment came suddenly during that time of relative normalcy. And that's what's going to happen when the Lord comes. The beginning of the broad day of the Lord is going to catch the world by surprise during a time of relative normalcy. And yet the other aspect that he focuses on here is the simultaneous removal of the righteous on the same day that the judgment begins to be poured out upon the wicked, right? It's explicit here. Until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came, right? And if you look at Luke 17's version of this, we're not going to go into it right now. It's even more explicit, right? So let's continue on. Now, then in verse 40, you can put the next slide up. And if you want to read that one, you can go ahead.
Then two shall be in a field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch, therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched, and would have not suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore, be ye also ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man cometh.
Perfect. So, Jesus, it's important to note, we already talked about it, this peri-day, now concerning, right? But it continues here into verse 40, this change in context, right? We see that there's two people in the field. One is taken and one is left. Two women are grinding at the mill. One is taken and one is left. And then the conclusion is this: watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. Okay, I want to ask you a question. If you're following the context, this is not the end of the tribulation.
I thought it was until, And because I heard a teaching on this, and because I was always under the impression one will be taken, one will be left, kind of like the Left Behind song. Sleeping, I forgot who sang it. They redid it during a Left Behind movie, but I always thought that it was the final judgment, the wheat and the tares. That's what I thought that was as well.
So if we follow the context,
right?
Remember it changed at verse 36. Everything now is involving the same idioms of watchfulness,
Yeah.
the thief, the
Mhm.
unpredictability. There is nothing at all unpredictable about the second coming proper at the
Mm.
end of the tribulation. It's the
Yeah.
climax of a series of predictable judgments that the Bible tells us exactly the sequence that they come in, and it
Mhm.
tells us when they happen, then know. Whereas here, it's all about you'll never know. It's
Yeah.
totally unpredictable. And so when it's referring to two people in the field and two people at the mill, one is taken and one is left, that is an expansion of what Jesus just referred to in the Noah story. In the Noah
Mm.
story, the righteous are removed and the wicked immediately are faced to enter judgment. So
Mhm.
i- what is this referring to? Well, what's the removal of the righteous?
The rapture.
We're going to continue to talk about that. The context does not allow you to get this wrong. It's so easy once you understand the context. Now, Jesus hadn't explained a rapture yet, right?
Mhm.
He's in the process, though, of planting seed doctrine. He didn't expect them to have an understanding of a rapture in the way that we understand it today. We are the beneficiaries of Pauline revelation. Everything that Paul wrote to the church about and fully defined and explained all of these doctrines, they didn't have that. In fact, they didn't even know about a church age yet. In fact, the disciples, even after Jesus was ready to ascend back to heaven, they still were asking him these questions. They still didn't
Mhm.
really get it. And so Jesus knew that. He understood that. And as a master teacher, he doesn't expect you to absorb a whole new paradigm, right? Their paradigm was Jewish eschatology. That's their background. That's what they understand.
Mhm.
And so Jesus was beginning the sequential gradual introduction of something new. He's revealing new revelation, but he's doing so sequentially, gradually. He's planting these seed doctrines in seed form that are later going to be watered and brought to germination, not only by his continued teaching, which he then continues to teach about the rapture in John 14, 1-3, only a day or two later, but yet more fully through the ministry of the Apostle Paul, who would break down the church. What is the church? What is the rapture of the
Mhm.
church? He would give us the full understanding of these doctrines that Jesus only introduced by planting in seed form, right? And
Mhm.
so um, I want to continue here, but I want you to note that everything we're saying aligns perfectly.
Mhm.
Because if you look back to what we introduced when we were looking at the birth pangs in 1 Thessalonians 5, that statement of Paul about the day of the Lord coming suddenly during a time of peace and security. And he also uses the example of the thief. Well, what did Jesus just do here? He used the example of the thief a couple of verses earlier. And
Mhm.
so the concept is this: if Paul is clearly applying the thief analogy to the beginning of the broad day of the Lord and the coterminous rapture, which the rapture happened simultaneously at the beginning of the day of the Lord, and actually that was Paul's context at the end of the previous chapter 4, 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18, he introduced the most defined teaching of the rapture that we have in the entire New Testament. And then he continues into the passage that we read. So his context was the coterminous or simultaneous rapture of the church and beginning of the broad day of the Lord. And he uses that idiom of a thief to describe it. That
Mm.
leaves us no option other than to accept that Jesus is doing the same thing here. Because unless you're going to say that Jesus and Paul use the same idiom in the same context, in a totally different context, then you're bound to the understanding that if Paul understood Jesus that way, then we have to also.
Mm.
So let's continue now. I want to. Can you bring up the quote by Dr. Thomas? It starts with the day.
Mhm. It's on the screen.
Okay. And so if you want to read that, this is just going to refer to what we discussed about the periday that occurs in verse 36 and how it's transitional from a context standpoint. And
Okay.
it gets into a following slide.
Okay. The day that begins verse 36 must be transitional because the 6th verse changes the discussion of signs preceding the second coming proper to emphasize that no signs will precede the parousia, the beginning of the broad day. Periday 2436 is a frequent device for introducing a change from one phase of a subject to another phase of the same subject, or from one subject to another subject. The verse introduces an aspect of the coming different from the one pointed in Matthew 24:29 through 31. The verb depicting the coming in 24:30 is ekronomenon. How do you say that word?
I think it's erkomenon.
Okay, sure. But the noun designating the coming in 24:37 is parousia, a term that easily covers a wider span.
Okay, so without making a big deal out of this, what Thomas is basically pointing out is what we discussed about periday and how it refers to a change in a shift, but not to a totally different context, a shift to a different nuance, often of the same context. But he points out that the Greek word used for coming in 24:30, now that refers to the what I call the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. We didn't read through this verse, but you can do it on your own time, or if you have your Bible open. The word that's used there is erkomenon, but then the noun or the word that's then used only 7 verses later, after Jesus switches context in verse 36, is parousia. And so what he's trying to get across is that even in the usage of the different Greek words for the coming, there's clearly a change in context. If Jesus was still talking about the second coming at the end of the tribulation, the second coming proper, he would have probably used this word erkomenon again, because that's what he was using to specifically refer to that aspect of the coming in verse 30. But yet he introduces again parousia, right? The word that was used at the beginning of the discourse. And it covers, as we discussed, a wider span. The parousia doesn't begin at the second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. The parousia, as we've discussed, it begins at the rapture, the beginning of the broad day of the Lord. All right. So, and again, we find this exact same notable shift in context in Mark 13:32 to 37. You can write these down, go look at them yourself. And then also in Luke 21:34 to 36. All right. So, but we are going to take a look at them. So if you want to pull up the next slide, this is Luke 21 verses 28 to 30. And we're going to see, I actually began slightly before the shift takes place, right? So this is still referring to the day of the Lord. And Kim, if you want to read this.
And when these things, all of the broad day of the Lord,
that's my own. That's just my own.
So don't read that.
Parenthetical. Well, so I'll go ahead and read it actually. So,
okay.
And when these things being all of the broad day of the Lord signs that Jesus just listed, just like in Matthew 24, begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Again, what people like to put into the church age, but it's day of the Lord context. And he continues, and he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. All right. So another indicator that the context is not the beginning of, it has nothing to do with the church age there. The context is right before the end of the tribulation when the Lord comes back in power. It's indicated by this mention of the kingdom of God is nigh at hand, right? So the kingdom of God is not nigh at hand right now. The kingdom of God, that refers to the millennial kingdom, the messianic kingdom, the millennium, which is going to take place right after the Lord's second coming at the end of the tribulation. So it's the next thing to take place. So it makes sense that Jesus here would mention, when you see all the signs leading up to the tribulation at the end of the second coming, of course, the next thing that's at hand is the establishment of the millennial kingdom. So again, that's another proof that this is not the church age. All right. We are the church age. What we're living in right now, we're not expecting the kingdom of God to be established at any minute. The kingdom is the messianic kingdom. All right, but now let's continue. Only a couple of verses later, in verse 34, we see the shift take place. Now, all of a sudden, he says this, and take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day, the day of the Lord, come upon you unawares. So he's not talking about in the day of the Lord anymore. Now he's shifting to the when. He's shifting back to the beginning, the absolute beginning, the onset, the initiation of the day of the Lord. He's warning them that that day can come upon you unaware if you're not ready for it. He continues, for as a snare, again, imminence language, suddenness, as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, imminence language, and pray always that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Now, there's only one way to escape the onset of the day of the Lord. What is it?
The rapture.
The rapture. That's it. And so this is an early, what I like to call a seed doctrine. Jesus is planting seed doctrine of the rapture. He didn't expect them to understand a rapture as we understand it right now at this point. He's introducing something new to them. He's simply wanting them to understand that at the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, as the judgment suddenly begins to come upon like a snare, he says it to them, on the world, the wicked world, there's a removal of the righteous. There's a rescue of the righteous that will take place that you can take part in if you're ready for it when it happens. And later, they would learn to understand that what Jesus was referring to was the rapture. That's the rapture is the only imminent removal of a righteous group at the beginning of the day of the Lord. There's just no other context for that. And let's now move on to Mark 13, 28 to 30. We're going to see the exact same thing here. It's so easy.
Do you want me to read that? Give your voice a break?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When her branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is near. So ye in like manner, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know that it is nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done.
Right. So again, that's just like the segment that we read in Luke 21 just a moment ago. And it's like what we read in Matthew 24. But now if you want to put the next slide up, now in verse I think there may be a discrepancy here. I have 32 as the first verse, but in the reference I put 33, but it's 32. I'm going to read this if you don't mind.
I don't mind at all.
So now note the shift. But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. Take ye heed, watch and pray. It sounds a lot like what Jesus just told them in Luke. You know, take ye heed, watch and pray, for ye know not when the time is. For the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch. Imminence language. More imminence language. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, and at even or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. So it's all imminence language. It's referring to us. This is stuff that we need to listen to today. We need to watch for the coming of the Lord, which means to be ready for it. There are no signs. There's no signs to watch for. It's that we're supposed to watch for him, because there are no signs. We have to be perpetually ready for his coming, and that's the simple meaning. But all of this is all imminence language, and I want you to see that shift. Now, I want to also point out that he uses this. He not only uses the example of a thief in parallel passages, but here he uses this idea of the master of the house coming home, or the master on the threshold of entrance. This is another idiom that an idiom of imminence that Jesus uses along with the thief. And what we find, we can't go into it right now, but if you read the book of James, you're going to note that James uses this same example that Jesus uses of the coming of the master of the house, this imminence example, and he attributes it, he applies it, he uses it in reference to the rapture of the church. In a non-debatable passage, he applies it to the rapture of the church. And so again, just like Paul, the understanding is, if that's how James understood this teaching of Jesus, to refer to the rapture and the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord, when the righteous are rescued and the wicked are plunged into immediate judgment suddenly. If that's how he understood it, then that's how we have to understand it. Make sense?
Absolutely.
All right. So I have a quote that, if you'd like to go ahead and read that, that's John Hart.
While the second coming of Christ is as highly predictable through preceding signs as summer is predictable to the signs of the springtime budding of a fig tree, verses 32 through 36, verses 36 through 44 present a contrasting event. Verses 36 through 44 describe the imminent, unpredictable coming of the day of the Lord. As such, the Lord now answers the first question of the disciples, verse 3, about when the end time events will commence. When the events within the day of the Lord are present, then Christ's coming, the second coming proper, is near. But the timing of the broad day of the Lord itself cannot be known. Only slide, or go to the next one.
That's it. And actually,
Okay.
that concludes our section number 4. So we have one section remaining, and we're going to talk about a lot of the things that we've already talked about. So I don't want to pause right now. I'd like to just continue until the end of this, and then we'll take questions, if that's okay.
I'm starring them, so you're good. And plus, I got to go potty. So,
Okay. Well, you know what? I was afraid of that too, because I've been drinking, trying to stay hydrated with this cold
yeah,
I'm getting over. And
me as well. My voice has to stay part. I mean,
yeah. So
yeah.
we'll make this part quick. And it's really just, it's who are the righteous in this discourse? And honestly, we've already talked about it. I kind of melded this section with, our discussion as we've gone through it. And so we really don't have to take a whole lot of time. But we've seen the two contrasting halves of the discourse, right? First the what, and then the when, or the signs and then the timing. And we've seen the shift in context at verse 36. We've seen that Jesus uses this example of the flood of Noah's day. His analogy focused on those two very specific aspects of the suddenness of the judgment on a world that was preoccupied with normalcy of life, and also the simultaneous same-day rescue of the righteous and judgment of the wicked, right? We don't have to rehash it all over again, but this context it does not fit with any period of time during the broad day of the Lord. It can only refer to the time period directly prior to the initiation of the broad day of the Lord. Again, that's the only time period that can take the world off guard. It's the only time period that can begin suddenly. It's the only time period that can result in the simultaneous rescue of the righteous and beginning of wrath upon the wicked. It's the only time that can refer to the normalcy of life. And it's the only time that can refer to the beginning of the coming of the day of the Lord, as so many of these passages said, or the beginning of the judgment, the beginning of the birth pangs, not the climax, not the end, which is the second coming proper. And so, we have a couple more quotes here that you can put up if you want, and then we can just move right to questions. I'm pretty much done at this point.
What do you
Um,
want me to do? It so scroll
yeah, if
past
you
this,
want to
Matthew.
scroll to Dr. Thomas, you
Okay.
can read that.
Is this
Uh,
it's beginning at after 2436?
yeah, and then it continues to the next slide.
Okay. I mean, I'm good on time, so my bladder hurts, but that's
Yeah,
fine. I'm
I,
used to
I'm
doing this.
getting a little tight on time, and I'd like to leave some time for questions. And I don't want to
Okay.
rehash too much that we already discussed because I did interweave this into the last section. But if I again, I want to make sure everyone understands that this is not some stuff that Mike, dreamt up on the night where he, had too much turkey after Thanksgiving. So this is a quote from Dr. Thomas, who's literally the best of the best. He wrote the best commentary on the book of Revelation in the history of the church age, bar none. And his scholarship is second to none. So I want you to understand that what I just presented to you, he's going to tell you right now.
So read right after 2436. I'm on
Please.
the right side. Okay.
Yeah.
After 20, again, this is referring to Matthew 24:36. Jesus looks at the events of the broad day of the Lord as a whole and how the beginning of that broad day will catch everyone by surprise, with no indication that it is at the door. Jesus illustrated the complete unexpectedness of the series of events by noting the parallel of his coming to inflict wrath on the world with the way God caught the world by surprise with the flood in Noah's day. And we already read that in verses 37 through 39. Next slide or same slide?
Yep. Next.
Okay. The victims did not know about it until the flood happened. That will be the case when the Son of Man returns, the parousia, the beginning of the broad day. The world will not know until the period is underway. They will have no warnings such as those alluded to in the parable of the fig tree. Continue or?
That's it. Perfect.
Okay.
So honestly, we've kind of covered a lot of what I wanted to go over in this section because this section was to be all about the context of the righteous. Who are the righteous in this discourse? And as I think I've clearly laid out already, the only conclusion that we can come to when we include all of the evidence is that the righteous, if the context is the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord, then if Jesus is referring to a sudden, imminent removal of the righteous at that time period, at the same time period that imminent judgment is beginning to fall on the wicked, then that can only refer to one context. That's the church. And the only rescue of the church is the rapture of the church. And so, there's this confusion about, is the rapture in the Olivet Discourse? Well, the answer is yes and no. The word rapture is not. The full understanding of what Paul would later describe to us is not. And the audience at that time certainly was not expected to understand it as such. But yet the concept is there. The seed doctrine that Jesus is planting can be nothing other than early rapture teaching because of the context. It holds us to it. And this was the way that the later subsequent New Testament authors, again, like Paul, like James, and as we would also find out if you read my book, like Peter and like John and like Jesus's own subsequent statements in Revelation clearly force us to accept. And so, I could probably go further on this, but I don't want to belabor it, and I do want to leave some time for questions.
Well, with that being said, I just also want to give you just some encouragement because I think the last time you were here, I didn't feel like that was kind of the vibe, unfortunately. And I feel like this particular podcast was phenomenal. Not that the first one was, and I enjoyed that as well. But so this is just to stroke your ego just for a moment. I know that's not why you're here. He's not here for that, guys. I'm just saying the last time Mike was here, myself included, it just wasn't, at times it wasn't very pleasant. Comments weren't pleasant. The reaction to my email box wasn't very pleasant. But Mike, unfortunately, does a great job at properly dissecting the Word of God, of which we all should do. We all need to be a Berean. Check him, see what he says is true. And hence the reason he's doing scholarly quotes as well, because again, he didn't eat just turkey dinner one night and come up with this. But anyway, our beloved Carly who also read your book. Mike's doing a great job. Vindog, this is interesting. Mike is quoting great scholars. Great teaching. Thank you for leading us through this. And then finally from Pippa, I'll take notes and screenshots when I watch again. And at the moment, I'm so riveted. Thanks so much, Kim. So honestly, this is something that the only part that I was, and I'll tell you why I got confused though, Mike, is because I was hearing teachers talk about that verse 36 and onward as something that really, I was never confused until I started listening, of all honesty, YouTube teachers. And I really thought even the description of the thief, that's what I thought. And I'm thinking, well, okay, well, oh, maybe I've been wrong the whole time. And well, no, I've been right the whole time. And that's the thing is it's okay for iron to sharpen iron, but we always have to make sure that we are keeping the Bible in context. Okay, so quick question.
And so if I can just
ahead.
jump in,
Yeah.
So the normal, right? I think the majority interpretation is that verse 36 and everything thereafter just continues to talk about in sequence what Jesus already was talking about. They don't recognize a shift back to the beginning of that entire period. So in other words, they would tack that right onto what Jesus just talked about, his second coming proper at the end of the tribulation, completely ignoring the problems with the context that we only started talking about it. There's many more problems that I can spend a whole lot more time going over that, but I think
I guess you're just going to be a regular, Mike. How about that? Okay.
Well, let me, Kim, I said we can go to questions, but can I retract that for a moment? There's one more quote that I would like you to read. I think people will relate to this because again, it involves this idea of the thief analogy, which I think is just, I mean, it's the smoking gun here. If nothing else gets through to you, I mean, you gotta grasp the thief analogy. And so this is John Hart again. It starts with the Perusia of Matthew 24.
Okay.
You can read that.
The Perusia of Matthew 24, 37 and 39 cannot be preceded by any signs, not even the seal judgments of Revelation or the signs of Matthew 24, 6 through 7, which parallel many of the seal judgments. There can be no forewarning if we are to honor the surprise element resident in the thief analogy in 24:43. A thief does not willingly signal his presence, but numerous telltale signs will precede Christ's second coming at the climax of the tribulation. Continue or we're done.
That's it. Although I have one more also excellent quote from John Hart. And if you want to skip ahead until you find it, it starts with surprisingly.
Yep.
And let me set this up for you a little bit. So what I've heard so many times is that what I presented today, what the scripture clearly says, about this rescue of the righteous occurring at the moment of the beginning of the day of the Lord, simultaneous with the outpouring of the beginning of wrath, that when Jesus mentions these things in the Olivet Discourse, this can't be referring to anything related to the church because the church hadn't been fully disclosed yet. Well, I want to remind you that the church had been already mentioned by Jesus, surprisingly, in Matthew, in first chapter 13 and then chapter 18. And so the concept, the seed doctrine of the church had already begun to be planted by Jesus. Jesus already did refer to the church. So this whole idea of that Jesus can't be referring to anything that we later would understand to refer to the church age in Matthew 24, that just can't be sustained. That idea just is not, it's not, you can't defend it when you look at the fact that he already had been teaching about the church. Maybe not in, he didn't expound on it. They still didn't understand it. Certainly it wasn't given Pauline revelation yet, but that doesn't mean Jesus can't refer to anything that people would later be able to understand as referring to the church. He refers to tons of things that have to do with us today. And the whole issue of the rapture also can't be in Matthew 24 or the Olivet Discourse because, someone told me very adamantly that the rapture was first disclosed in John 14, 1-3. Well, that's an opinion statement. And that was only about a day or two after the Olivet Discourse. So if you're going to take such a strong opinion that Jesus couldn't begin to disclose rapture doctrine until the day after I'm saying it happened, then what are we even arguing about? I'm
Mm.
saying that no, he actually started to sequentially plant this doctrine a day earlier or two.
Mhm.
And then he followed up on that in John 14, 1-3, that famous bridegroom's promise. I go to prepare a place for you. I'm going to take
Mhm.
you to be with me, right? That only occurred a day after the Olivet Discourse or two, right? They
Mhm.
occur almost at the same time. And
True.
so there's no reason to assume that Jesus couldn't have already started the planting of his seed doctrine in the
Mhm.
Olivet Discourse. He didn't give as much information on it as he would in that passage of John, but that's exactly to be that's
You're
exactly to
fine.
be expected, where
Mm.
Jesus incrementally discloses this new understanding.
Yeah.
And so this quote by John Hart summarizes
Mhm.
basically what I just said. So you can go ahead and it's two sequential slides.
Okay. Surprisingly, it is Matthew alone among the Gospels that introduces the term church, Matthew 16:18 and 18:17.
And let me just interject again. I
Mhm.
note both of these are before Matthew 24. Jesus
Mhm.
already talked about it. All right.
Mhm.
Sorry. Continue.
You're all right. Since the disciples did not understand the new doctrine of the church yet, they were introduced to it in Matthew
Yet,
16 and
so
18.
hang on.
Yeah.
So since the disciples did not introduce the new doc I'm sorry, since the disciples did not understand the new doctrine of the church, yet they were introduced to it in Matthew 16 and 18, could they not be introduced to the pre-tribulational rapture of the church in Matthew 24 and yet not be expected to fully comprehend it until later? In fact, only a few days later in the upper room discourse, Jesus introduces the rapture to his disciples, John 14, 1-3. Pre-tribulationalists find no difficulty in accepting here, the upper room discourse, a new revelation for the church, even though even though this, duh, even though the disciples could not fully comprehend church truth at this time. And so I love that quote,
Mhm.
because it just takes away all of the arguments of why we can't understand that Jesus was beginning to disclose in the Olivet Discourse what we later would understand with full Pauline revelation,
Mhm.
the epistles of Paul, what we would later understand to be the rapture of the church. The
Correct.
context absolutely demands it. And the fact that the subsequent authors used the same idioms of Jesus and applied them the same way clearly to the rapture is just a confirmation that we can't overlook. So we can move now to the questions.
Okay. Um, well, hold on. A few more people just kind of really enjoying this, and I'm glad everyone's staying because I've enjoyed this tremendously. This is a big old steak and much to chew on. That was from Okie Girl, and then Just Vicky. I
It's
have
prime.
enjoyed.
It's a filet mignon.
It is. It's my favorite. I have enjoyed this Bible study, and then here's another one. Patriot Mom. I've enjoyed this, a very in-depth Bible study that everyone needs to hear. And then this one, David says that, yes, I need to make you a regular, Mike.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
and then Dale says this here, when Christ returns, no one will be expecting it, and he will not enter this world by stealth. When Christ returns, his coming will be spectacular. Then everyone will know he has arrived. And just so you know, throughout the duration of this, my wonderful best friend Carly was also amening and agreeing and
So
just solidifying
so
everything I
I
said.
I would ask you to put that back up. So I think the person commenting is in a form disagreeing with me. So and the cause for the misunderstanding here is, again, what aspect of the Perusia are we talking about? So she says, when Christ returns, right, the Perusia,
Hmm.
no one will be expecting it. That's correct if you're referring to the beginning of the Perusia, right?
Oh, I
When
took
the,
that as rapture. I thought she meant that by the
well,
rapture.
well, yeah, when the rapture happens and the broad day begins, yes,
Hmm.
that's correct. Nobody will be expecting it, and he will not enter this world, by stealth. So that would be contradictory. So he is, and you could say he's entering the world by stealth in a sense, in the sense that at at that point in the Perusia, nobody's going to know what happened. The whole point is that it is by stealth. That's a thief. A thief operates by stealth. So the beginning of it is completely stealth. It's all unpredictable. It's all sudden. It's all signless. So that by definition, that's the stealth aspect. And then she
Mhm.
says, when Christ returns, again, we have to specify what aspect of the Perusia. His coming will be spectacular, that everyone will know he has arrived. And that's, yes, that's true also, but that's not referring to the beginning of the Perusia. That would be the end of the Perusia, right? So that would be his second coming proper at the end of the tribulation when he comes in power and great glory. So there's these, again, and that's why we took so much time to delineate and to define this Greek term, the Perusia, because it refers
Mm.
to both. And so, yes, the beginning part is absolutely stealthy. It's the way he
Mhm.
comes is stealthy. And I'm not saying that after it happens, people aren't going to know. No, people are going to know that the church has been removed, and there's going to be the immediate outpouring of judgment. So if that's what you meant by stealth, but his actual coming when it initiates, that's going to
Mhm.
happen completely stealthily. But at the end, yes, his second coming proper at the end, yes, all eyes will see him. I mean, absolutely. The whole
So I
point of
think that's
that
how
is
she meant it, though.
spectacular. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's how she meant it. She might have worded it wrong. I mean, because I read it as though Dale meant that, the rapture was stealth. No one's gonna see it, and then at the end of it, everyone's gonna know it. That's how I read it, and Carly said she read
Okay.
it wrong as well. That's what I'm
Okay.
thinking
It's,
she meant
it's
by that.
possible I read it wrong.
No, you're
Yeah.
reading it correct, but I don't think that's really what she
What you
meant,
meant. Okay.
though. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Got
I
it.
mean, I
Got it.
could be
Got it.
wrong, so Dale, I don't wanna speak for you, but I mean,
Right.
I
And
know her
I just
well enough
wanted
to
to make
think.
sure that we understand those aspects of Perusia, and that's really the point there. So I'm sorry if I'm sorry, Dale, if I got that wrong.
No worries. I mean, she'll correct me. Don't worry about it. We're all good. Okay, so one question here from Okie Girl. She says, peace and security. Is this referring to Israel or the world?
So it's referring to the context immediately prior to the initiation of the broad day of the Lord. So a better question, if I could say it that way, may be, is it referring to the church age, or is it referring to the day of the Lord after the church age? And the answer is the church age. The church age is the time immediately prior to the onset of the broad period of the day of the Lord, which that was Paul's context. So in other words, it's going to arise suddenly out of a time of peace and security. Or like Jesus said, people are marrying and giving in marriage. It's relative normalcy. Whereas that context cannot in any way relate to the time directly before his second coming proper at the end of the tribulation. That's going to be the most horrific time period the world has ever experienced.
Because I do know that a lot of people, and I've heard them on YouTube, popular pastors and stuff, use that solely for Israel. So I can see, because I have been under that assumption as well, because I've heard pastors always say that peace and security. And then I heard it differently tonight, which then meal piecing this all together, I was like, well, dang, been wrong on that too.
Well, it's like, not to introduce another thing here, but it's the Bible. The more you look at it, it all confirms itself. I mean, we could just keep going, and I could just keep giving you more examples.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
if you look in the writings of Peter, he describes the complete signlessness of the time immediately before the day of the Lord. In fact, he points to the fact that people at that time will be in such doubt that the day of the Lord could even happen, which means they're not in it at the moment.
mhm,
It's the church age. It's prior to
mm,
the day of the Lord begins, because by definition, as the church ends, then the day of the Lord begins. So it's no time during the day of the Lord that Peter is talking about when he says people are going to be, scoffing and mocking even at the idea that the day of the Lord could take place. And they totally discount the fact that previous days of the Lord already have taken place. One
mhm,
example he gives is the days of Noah, right? That was a
mhm,
previous event that is a day of the Lord, you could say. And it's certainly an example that Jesus gives to refer to, the final eschatological judgment. And
mhm.
Peter's whole point is that it's going to be a time of such signlessness, such normalcy, that even the scoffers at that time are going to be saying there's no proof of his coming. I mean,
Yeah.
can you imagine somebody in the tribulation saying there's no proof of his coming? That would contradict other areas
Great
in
point.
Scripture which explicitly say that the wicked at that time do know that he's coming. In fact, at the end, they gather to fight him. They anticipate his coming so precisely that they are literally gathered to fight Jesus when he comes at the end of the tribulation. I mean, we can't even fathom that. So there's no denial at that point. So the context is always, anytime you see these watchfulness passages, these thief in the night passages, these passages that refer to the unknowingness of the time, the unpredictability, the suddenness, it always refers to the same thing, the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord that initiates with the rapture. So if it's describing the onset of the day of the Lord, then it arises out of a context of the church age. The church age ends and it begins. So if it's saying that there's a time of peace and safety and then sudden destruction comes, which demarcates the beginning of the day of the Lord, then by definition, the peace and safety occurs directly prior to it. Well, what's directly prior to it is the church age.
Agreed. And the thing too, and let me just say this, Pippa, while you're still here before if you leave me, please just shoot me an email. I know this is off topic, sorry, but she's here. So for some reason Mike's didn't generate, your email's not generating, and I need to send you an email. So please just shoot me an email, Pippa. Thank you. Okay. So Mike, the thing too, and I don't know if anyone else is feeling this way for the few that are still left, but let me just express, this is how I feel. When I hear, which I don't listen to any of them, YouTube people about doom, gloom, all I get is anxiety, worry, fear, doubt. Shall I build a bunker in my apartment? Do I need to build my garden out there? I always have this, oh gosh, I can't, I have this fear, which God does not want us to have a spirit of fear. But when I then dive into the Lord can come literally right now, and reading these scriptures, it just refreshes my spirit to know that I don't need to look for what's around me to know that my Savior's coming for me. I just need to know that he said, I'm coming. I've prepared a place. Be ready. That to me speaks more volumes than everything else here. Now, I know the world's a hot mess. I'm not saying the world is, and I know you agree with that as well. I think the church is a hot mess, the world that we're living in, our administration, doesn't matter. Globally, this world stinks right now. But there is such a sense of fear that God, so that alone contradicts the very nature of who God is. The only time fear should ensue is during the tribulation. If I'm hiding in a cave and I want rocks to fall on me, that's fearful. They say it's the judgment of God. So I just wanted to say that I have peace knowing I live my life to the fullest every day. I go out there and I want to make sure that I'm sharing the gospel, but I'm living my life. And I joke with the Lord in my prayer time and say, can you just kind of make the news quiet for like 6 months? Like not a peep, nothing. And then what would happen, right? If things just went literally peace and security, because technically I think the whole world is really at peace and security. I'm sure you can probably do a deep dive on what that truly means. But anyway, I just had to say that because I do feel peace. And I'm going to get to that last question. But again, I had some people in the chat. Yes, Terry, I think that was you. Everything that we're discussing here tonight is in this book. I mean, I have little tabs here, as you guys can see, and he sections it off. He writes it and then he brings it full circle. So it's like he kind of writes and then brings it around and then goes into something else and then talks about imminence. So again, this is the book, The Missing Key. I highly recommend that you pick it up. It is thick. There's a lot of times I had to Google that word because I had no idea. But anyway, great book, pick it up. But yes, everything we're discussing tonight and the previous time that Mike was on here is from that book.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, I also plan to be discussing a lot of this on my YouTube channel. So if you're
Oh, yeah,
interested in
yeah.
this in that kind of content, I've already started to put out some short videos. Some are a little bit longer, but I'm going to break it down, to this level of granularity. So, I would encourage you to go over there. Just find me, Let Us Reason channel. I think it is. I think
It's in
Kim
the
has
description
a
box.
link in the description. Yeah, and
I
just
sure do.
subscribe.
I got all your good stuff there. So it looks like the final question is coming in from Just Vicky. I don't know if she's still here. So are these things we will see the similar things to the birth pangs?
So I would have to know what that quote, "these things," is referring to, because it sounds to me like the questioner may be uh, taking one of the passages that we said take place in the day of the Lord
Correct. When we
and
were talking
attributing
about
it to
Matthew,
us.
right, or
Right.
Luke,
So,
whatever it was, because that's when she penned this question.
right.
That's when
So
it
if you're
prompted.
referring to any of the passages from the Olivet Discourse that say things like, when you see all of these things, know that the kingdom of God is near.
She just
When you see
answered.
all of I'm not aware of Jesus saying that we would see any things. That's kind of the whole point that we've been discussing, is that the church will not see those things. Those are day of the Lord occurrences, things like the birth pangs, the sequence of events, the signs that occurred during the day of the Lord, unless, uh, sorry, is that a clarification
Oh,
there?
no, I'm
Or,
sorry. My bad. Trying to hide the comment. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. I thought it was a new. Yeah, we're not going to see any of that. That's kind of the whole point, is that the church is distinct from what happens after the church is evacuated at the rapture. uh, the signs that Jesus gave, again, they're day of the Lord signs. It's a sequence of events that happens after the rapture in the broad period called the day of the Lord. And the final sign is his second coming proper at the end of the tribulation in power and great glory. That's the final climactic sign. And so Jesus was always telling the audience who's going to be alive at that time. He specifies which generation, which audience he's referring to. The one that sees the beginning of the signs is going to be the same one that's there to see the ending of the signs, or that climactic sign of his coming in power at the end of the tribulation. So that's how we know that that whole time period is going to be confined to a generation or less. It's not our generation. It has nothing to do with us. That's day of the Lord. Unless you're a firmly committed post-tribulationalist and you expect to be here for that, or if you miss the rapture, then yes, unfortunately, you will be there to see those things. But if you take the view that I do, a pre-tribulational rapture, which is the only view that's consistent with what was presented today, then you are not going to see any of those things.
And I think too, so in everyone's defense, myself included, I think we're all just, because there's so many different teachers out there, so many YouTube is a confusing cesspool, if you want my honest opinion, because everybody is just kind of all over the place. So, I think that a lot of people struggle, Mike, because they're not. And again, I mean, ultimately we have to, and I mean this for myself, so I'm not speaking to you, Vicky, or anyone else. We have to ultimately blame ourselves for not being a Berean and searching the word of God. So let's that's the first step, is us. We've got to read the word. But I think a lot of confusion is, and I think that's why the body of Christ is so confused about terms like that, right? Because we've heard it. I've heard it. I've
Right.
heard the thief analogy. And I feel like when we have to shift that paradigm to what really the Bible says, we have to untrain everything that we've trained in our mind to think of. So
Completely well
I
said.
totally get people on this chat and understanding, but hey, listen, they've stayed here to the end. I really am I've never dissected videos. I've never chopped them up before, but I feel like I'm just feeling that nudge from the Spirit to do this, because there's so much meat here. And that, again, I'm not pushing this book, guys, but I'm telling you, in this book, he dissects everything to where it's digestible, to where you can see the Bible. It's open in front of you. The passages are used. And I hate to keep pushing this book. He does not ask me to do this, just so you guys know. I am just telling you that that's how this is written, is from a scriptural, scholarly point of view. and everything in here. I mean, Carly, you've read it. I'm sure you can let people know that I'm not blowing smoke under people's butt. I'm not trying to say change your mind because Mike and Kim say so. This is really what the Bible teaches. And it's hard for us to retrain years upon years of Christianese way of thinking.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I agree totally with what you just said, and that I know I'm going to have to repeat things. I know it because people have been so poorly taught. People have,
Mhm.
and I said it earlier at the outset that so many teachers are so careless with the way that they just kind of throw these expressions around, and it gets
Mhm.
into our psyche, and we
Mhm.
literally have to uh, rip it out, because
Yeah.
it's not good Bible
Right.
interpretation. And
Mhm.
so we have to change the way that we think. We have to get back to defining terms clearly. And that's what I was trying to do today. I mean, that's why we went through first, a deep dive into the day of the Lord. You can't understand any of this unless you understand what the day of the Lord is. And then the same thing with the birth pangs. If you don't understand the birth pangs, you're not going to understand what follows in the Gospels.
Mhm.
All of these are Old Testament concepts that the disciples understood. They didn't have YouTube to mess them up. They were
Right.
correctly taught in Jewish eschatology,
Mhm.
and they had that correct understanding in place, but we don't today. We're suffering from
Mm.
poor teaching and the
Yeah.
way that they just throw these passages. I call it dispensationally misapplying passages. They're
Mhm.
taking something from the next dispensation and they're putting it into this dispensation,
Mhm.
and that's going to result always in confusion.
I agree. I agree. So I guess we can sum this up. And if you want to just, I'm always going to do my Jeff Kinley though, as always. So I don't know if you want to bring it in for a landing. I don't see any other questions. Yes, please. I see a lot of people. Subscribe to Mike's channel. Again, Carly's posting the link in the comments, but I also have all of his information in the description box. So go ahead and click on it. I've listened to, I think, everything that's up there so far. So, which I think is 3, correct?
Yeah, I
Or
only
is it
have 3
2?
videos
Oh,
plus
you had
our.
one, and then did you remove one? Because I watched something and then it was, like, gone, and then it was, like, put up there
No,
or
so I
something.
have our first podcast, and then I have 3 videos that I did. The
Mhm,
first 2 are around watchfulness. A lot of people are very confused on what watchfulness is. They think it means physically watching for signs,
mhm.
and that's not what it means in Scripture. And then I did a teaching on the apostasy and the Antichrist.
Correct,
Do
that's the
those
one.
occur in the church age, or do those occur in the day of
Right.
the Lord? And
Yeah.
so all of this comes from the book. But I'm going to continue to do these teachings. I put out in-depth articles, and those things are free. It's not going to cost you anything if you. And honestly, if you really want to read the book, I can't believe I'm putting this out just publicly, but please email me. And if you can't afford you
Mhm,
can get it for $10. Uh,
mm,
the the non-paperback, right? The Kindle version. And if you are being honest and you can't afford $10, I will personally send you a PDF of the book, because it's not really about money. I want everyone
mm.
to have access to good information. So
Amen.
I put that out. If you truly
Mm.
need help, I will give you help.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. It's not Audible yet though, right?
No,
Okay,
I'd
girl,
like
just
to do
asked.
that at some point, but
Mhm.
it's quite a process. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. So do you have any closing remarks before I end here and use the restroom that's been calling my name
Yeah.
for 2 hours now?
No, no, I won't, you know, uh, cause you to be separated from that experience, which I
I'm
need
sure
all.
your experience is probably a little heightened as
Well, look,
well, so
when you have a mug this big, you can come to your
yeah,
own
my
conclusion.
coffee here, and then I've got so that's, 12 ounces, and then I've
Yeah.
got my water, so
So, no,
oh,
again, I appreciate the opportunity to come on. I love talking about the
absolutely.
Bible, and,
Mm.
I love getting into the Word,
Yeah, you'll be back on.
and it's again, I wanna leave you with this.
Mm,
I wanna encourage you, when you get in the Word and you just forget about what people are saying, you just
mhm.
start reading the Word for what it says, connecting the
Yeah,
dots. It's actually really easy and it makes sense. And,
absolutely.
I would leave you all with that.
Absolutely. All right. So, guys, I'm going to leave you guys with something a little different than what we've been discussing tonight, only because I'm on 3 platforms now, Rumble and Facebook. And Facebook and Rumble, especially Facebook, it's open to the public. And I would not be doing anyone a justice if I didn't talk about Christ and the gospel and why we're even doing this and why we're talking about the rapture, because we don't want anyone left behind. So, first and foremost, if you don't know Christ, it's very simple. I mean, there's no magic pill, there's no magic prayer. You don't have to screw in a light bulb or go to some fancy church where they have you do circles in a dress. It's basically your recognition that you need a savior, and that savior is Jesus Christ. That savior, the gospel, is clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 4. He came, he died, he was buried, and he rose again. And it's simple. You believe through faith that that's who he is. And guess what? I don't know, Mike. You're saved, right? It's literally that easy. But people want to complicate it. People want to put chains and just they want to bind people to religion. And Jesus is not religion. He's a relationship. So with that being said, if you're listening to this and you want to be a follower of Christ, I'm not going to say some special prayer. I don't even know what to pray because I'm not in that relationship. That's like me trying to talk to, I don't know, someone's husband. I'm not in a relationship with them. I'm in a relationship with my own husband. So once you make that commitment to Christ, and again, there's going to be a struggle. That's what sanctification is all about. But once you're in that relationship, you're now allowed in heaven and you're not damned to a Christless eternity in hell. Jeff Kinley is a good friend of mine. He's an author, and he wrote this amazing book called God's Grand Finale. And I always try to end these podcasts, sometimes I do forget, of let's just say you've made that commitment to Christ tonight. So now why are you allowed in heaven? Would you pause and reflect for a moment on this glorious and wonderful truth? We who were once depraved, unrighteous, dead in sin, separated from the life of God, and condemned to a Christless eternity in hell, have now, by his grace, been saved, forgiven, adopted, brought near, made alive, made righteous, and given hope and an eternal home in heaven. So I implore you today, the Bible is very clear that we're not promised tomorrow. Life is but a vapor. I implore you today to make Christ, and I know people always say I'm lordship when I say this, but I like him Lord of my life. And I don't mean that in a lordship way, but I want him to be Lord of my life, not Lord of my works, not Lord of anything else. I want him Lord of my life. That's it. So isn't that funny? That's another Christianese term that you can't say anymore. I'm not accepting him in my heart, but I certainly want him to be the governor of my life. Absolutely. So anyway, Mike, as always, did you want to say something, brother? I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, no. I was listening to you.
All right. So as always, Mike, you've been a pleasure. I learned so much from you. My framework had to change a lot, even reading some portions of this book. I have some question marks, and then I go back and I read the passage for myself, not man's opinion. And I'm like, oh, I guess that is right. But you're phenomenal. And I know you come under a lot here by standing firm in this, and you're bucking a system that half of these people even believe in. So that doesn't make sense for me. Mm-hmm. But I know God's going to open doors for you. And guys, again, subscribe to his channel. He's smart. So he knows his stuff. And I love having you on. So again, yes, I'm not going to have a lot of guests on, but I don't know. I feel like you and Shane, I really enjoyed him when we spoke about The Chosen. I just feel this different nudging from the Lord. So hopefully you'll be back on, and we can talk about a plethora of stuff. And I really appreciate you coming on here, spending a little over 3 hours. You guys staying, this audience, my family members, you guys are wonderful. I absolutely adore you, love you. So very much. I am blessed, and I if I don't say it enough, I'm going to say it tonight, how much I love you and appreciate every single subscriber, friend in real life as well. Anyway, Mike, that's it for us here tonight. Do you want to say anything before I give us a...
No, I appreciate everyone watching, and God bless you.
All right, let me go ahead and get my stuff in order here because I got to click buttons, and I'm going to go ahead and end this, and hopefully this will all work out the way it should. I don't know. If not, smile bright, Mike, because I don't know if we're going to end with me and you at the end, or if I'm going to get this video right. So we'll just figure it out as we go. Bye, guys, until I see you here, there, or in the air. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoyed the content, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, head on over to our website, lifeclipspodcast.com, to find out more information. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, send us an email at questions@lifeclipspodcast.com. And as I always end it, I will see you here, there, or in the air.
Titus chapter 2, verse 13. Looking for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Christ Jesus.